The storytellers have long spoken of the age before ages, of a time so distant even memory had not yet been born. Here is how they tell it. For those who stay, a subscription to Olympus dreams is always there if you want more. Tonight we journey not to a battlefield, not yet. We journey instead to a quieter wrong, a silence buried deep beneath the earth, a weight that pressed and groaned and would not be forgotten, for every great war has a wound that came before it, and the wound that split the sky and shook the mountains for 10 long years began not with swords, not with fire, but with a father's fear and a mother's grief. Let the story breathe. Let it find you where you are. In the oldest telling, before the Titanomachy, before Zeus drew his thunderbolt, before the mountains of Olympus and Othrys became the axes of a shattered world, there was Gaia, and Gaia carried a sorrow inside her that no mortal language has ever quite named. She was the earth itself, broad and patient. Old before patience had a word. She had borne her children with care, each one shaped in the dark of her body, each one a wonder in its own right. The Titans had come first, 12 of them, vast and elemental, and the world had seemed to open a little wider to hold them. But she had not stopped there. From her body she had also brought forth beings of another kind, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires. Say their names slowly, as the old tellers did. Days, Steropes, Arges. These were the Cyclopes, each one immense and singular, each bearing a single eye that burned in the centre of the brow like a coal not yet gone cold. They were smiths by nature, craftsmen of the deep, and there was nothing simple about them. They understood the weight of stone and the patience of fire. Their hands were steady, and their minds, though ungentle, were sharp and capable of wonders. And then the others, the Hecatoncheires, Cronus, Briarrose, Gyges. They say these 3 were born into the world with 100 hands each, and 50 heads, and voices like the inside of a storm. They were enormous beyond measuring. When they moved, the ground remembered it. They were not beautiful, but they were real, and they were Gaia's children, and she had loved them as she loved all things that came from her body. Uranus did not see it that way. He looked upon them, and what he felt was not wonder. It was something older and meaner than wonder, a tightening in the chest, a quick and quiet terror. The Cyclopes were too strange. The Hecatoncheires were too vast, and power, in those earliest ages, had not yet learned how to share space with what it did not understand. So Uranus acted. The sky, that wide and arching father, descended upon the earth as he did each night, pressing close, and instead of holding his children with the care they deserved, he thrust them downward, into the deep places, past the roots of the mountains, past the layers of stone and dark water, down and down, into Tartarus itself, that yawning abyss beneath the earth, where the dark was not merely the absence of light, but a presence of its own, a weight, a silence that pressed back. The Hecatoncheires were sealed there, Cronus, Briarrose, Gyges, their 100 hands bound, their 50 heads bowed in the dark. The Cyclopes followed, Brontes, Steropes, Arges, their forge, bright eyes extinguished from the world above. The chains were not forged of ordinary metal. They held. The darkness held. And above them, unaware or unwilling to be aware, the world continued. But Gaia knew. She knew because she was the earth, and the earth does not forget what lies beneath it. Every step taken across her surface was also a step taken above her imprisoned children. She felt them in the way that rock feels a crack forming, slowly, with patience, and with the certainty that something will eventually give. The weight of their imprisonment was not only physical. It was the weight of injustice, which is heavier than stone and more durable than iron. Gaia had created these children with her own substance. She had carried them, and now they were buried alive in the pit at the bottom of everything, while Uranus arched his great body over her each night, as if nothing had been done, as if nothing had been taken. she groaned, not loudly. The earth rarely announces its suffering in a single cry. It speaks in tremors and shifts, in the slow crumbling of a cliff face, in the way water finds its way through places that seem sealed. Gaia's grief moved through the world the way deep things move, below notice. Below the level at which the Titans above went about their days, the Titans, those 12 children of earth and sky, went on in the open air. Oceanus circled the world with his great body of river water. Hyperion carried light from one edge of the sky to the other. Mnemosyne held memory like a still pool, and Themis moved through the world with the quiet authority of what is right and what is not. They did not speak of their imprisoned siblings, perhaps because Uranus had not told them, or perhaps because knowing is sometimes easier to set aside than to bear, but Gaia bore it. She bore it fully, as the earth bears everything. The tale does not tell us exactly how long this continued. Time in those earlier stages moved differently. There were no seasons yet as we know them, no count of years by harvest or by snowfall. But the wrong persisted, and a wrong that persists gathers weight, the way water gathers behind a dam. The way pressure gathers in stone before a fault line finally moves. It is important to hold this in mind as the story unfolds in the chapters ahead. The war that would come later, that great and terrible shaking of the world, did not begin with Zeus. It did not begin with Cronus. It began here in the dark, with 6 beings buried beneath the earth, because a Sky Father was afraid. It began with Gaia's grief, her patient, terrible, root-deep grief, pressing upward through the layers of the world like a seed seeking light. And from that grief, in time, she would act. But for now, the night was quiet above the ground. The Titans moved through their vast and early world. Uranus spread himself across the heavens, cold and vast and proud, and deep below the surface of everything, in a dark so complete even echoes did not travel, Cottus sat with his 100 hands folded in the silence. Briareus waited. Gyges, whose name some say means the long-limbed, held very still in the place where there was nothing to reach for. Brontes, whose name carried the sound of thunder, made no sound at all. And Gaia, the earth, breathed slowly, held her grief, began, in the deep stillness of that ancient time, to think. The storytellers say this is where it all began. Not with a battle, not with a prophecy, but with a mother who could not forget what had been done to her children, and who had within her the patience of the ground itself, and the certainty that the ground always, eventually, breaks. Rest now. Let that image settle. 6 beings in the dark, and the earth above them, quiet and waiting, already holding the shape of what would one day come, so Gaia thought. And thinking, for Gaia, was not the swift flicker of a mind turning over a problem. It was the slow deliberation of deep stone, the kind of thought that moves through the body of the earth the way heat moves through rock near a fire. Gradual, patient, without hurry, because the earth knows that time will accommodate it. She had felt the injustice for an age already. She had groaned beneath it. She had watched Uranus arch over her each night, proud and untroubled, while below the roots of mountains her children waited in chains that would not yield. And now, in the stillness of that ancient time, something in her resolved. The tale tells it this way. Gaia drew from herself what was needed. From the depths of her body, from the same substance that had formed her children, she brought forth a length of stone, not ordinary stone, not the grey-brown rock that lines riverbeds, or the soft limestone that crumbles under a palm. This was adamant, a word the old storytellers use for what cannot be broken, cannot be worn away, cannot be persuaded by anything the world might bring against it. She shaped it in the dark below the surface. No fire was needed, no forge. She pressed it with the weight of her own body, and it took the form she intended. Long, curved at the end, a sickle. serrated on its inner edge, meant for a single purpose, to sever what should not be able to be severed. The tale does not tell us how long the shaping took. Time, as we have already noted, moved differently in that age. When it was finished, Gaia held the sickle in the darkness beneath her own body and considered what must come next. A tool requires a hand. A plan requires a champion. She could not act against Uranus herself. She was the ground on which all things stood. She could crack and shift and groan, but she could not rise up and swing a blade. That was not the nature of the earth. She needed a son, so she went to them. One by one, in the manner the old stories describe, not in waking, not exactly. The Titans walked in the open air, vast and elemental, going about the work of a young world. Uranus watched from above. So Gaia moved through the only channels still open to her, through root and stone and the trembling below the surface, through the murmuring of deep water, through the way the ground shifts under a foot without quite falling. She came to Oceanus first. He was the eldest, that great encircling river being who wrapped himself around the world's edges like a patient border. The message she sent him moved through the ground beneath the waters. He felt it. The storytellers say he grew still for a time, his vast body pausing mid-circuit. Then he moved on. He would not act against his father. Whether from wisdom or from a nature too broad for personal grievance, Oceanus turned aside. Some accounts say he understood what was coming and simply wished no part of it. The tale does not condemn him for this. Chaos, she reached through the stone of the high peaks, where he often stood in the cold, thin air. He too felt the weight of her message. He too did not answer with agreement. Creus turned away. Hyperion, whose nature was bound to the carrying of light, did not pause his daily work to answer. Iapetus, some versions of the tale suggest, felt the trembling of her call and looked out over the world a long while, thinking. Then he too made no move to answer her summons. One by one they declined, not from cruelty, not from satisfaction with the wrong their father had done. The storytellers grant them something more complicated than that. Perhaps they feared Uranus, whose pride was enormous and whose sky pressed over every inch of their world. Perhaps they believed the wrong, however grievous, was beyond their reach to remedy. Or perhaps the kind of courage required to strike against one's father was a rarer thing than strength alone could provide. And then there was Cronus, the youngest of the Titan brothers. He was not the largest, nor the oldest, nor the one who carried the most visible power. Hyperion carried the sun. Oceanus encircled the world. But Cronus had something the others did not, a quality the tale describes with words like shrewd and watchful, and patient in the particular way that waiting for the right moment is different from simply waiting. When Gaia's message reached him, it came through the earth under his feet, a trembling so faint most living things would not have noticed it. He noticed. He stood very still and let it move through him, and he understood it not just as sensation, but as meaning. He answered, not aloud, not with a speech or a declaration. The storytellers describe it simply. He stepped forward. In the dark, beneath the notice of Uranus overhead, Cronus went to the place where Gaia had hidden the sickle. He reached down. He took it up. The adamant was cold in his hands. The curved blade caught no light because there was no light to catch. He held it in the dark and felt its weight, and the weight was not unpleasant. It felt like certainty. Gaia spoke to him then. The tale gives her words simply. Your father has wronged me. He has sealed your brothers beneath the world. He will not stop. She did not frame it as a request. She did not promise reward. She stated the wrong, and she named the instrument, and she left the choice to Cronus. He did not ask how or when. He had already begun to consider that. There is something the storytellers note here, a detail worth holding. When Gaia passed the sickle to her youngest son, when Cronus took it up and felt the resolve of that curved adamant blade in his grip. Something moved through the earth that was not quite a tremor and not quite a sound. It was the first faint suggestion of the thing that would one day be called prophecy. A sense of the future pressing against the present from the other side. Whether Uranus felt it from his great height above the world, the tale does not say for certain. But some versions add this, that the sky that night was very still, that the stars held their courses without shifting, that the cold air that moved across the mountains was quieter than usual, as if something vast had taken a breath and not yet released it. A stillness before a cut. Cronus stood in the open air with the sickle held along his side, out of sight, close to the earth, and he looked up at his father's great body spread across the heavens above him. He had always been below that sky. Every Titan had. Every living thing had stood beneath Uranus and felt the weight of that vast arching presence without ever questioning whether it was possible to remove it. Cronus questioned it now. He looked at the stars. He looked at the horizon where the sky touched the earth at its far edges. He felt the sickle's weight. And he waited for the moment that Gaia had whispered of, the moment when Uranus would descend, as he did each night, pressing close to the earth as he always did in the dark hours, unknowing, habitual. Proud, the night was very quiet. The world, as the tale has it, seemed to hold itself without motion, and somewhere below the feet of all living things, deep in the dark where 6 voices could not echo, Gaia also waited. Still, the way a fault line waits, with a certainty that what cannot be held indefinitely will, when the moment arrives, give all at once. Uranus came down as the night deepened. He did not announce himself. He never had. The sky simply lowered, the way it always did in the dark hours, the great arching presence pressing closer to the earth. Unhurried, habitual, the movement of a thing that had never once been challenged in its descent. Cronus felt the change in the air before he saw it. A heaviness, a closing of the distance between sky and ground. The stars, which had held so still, began to feel nearer. The cold grew denser. He tightened his grip on the sickle and did not move. He let Uranus come. What followed, the storytellers do not linger over in the manner of battles or declarations. They give it simply, without ornament. Cronus struck once with the curved adamant blade in the one moment when his father was close enough to reach and still unknowing. The sickle did not hesitate. Adamant never does. It was the nature of the thing. Shaped in the dark, it had been made without mercy, without apology, without any quality except the quality of completion. Uranus cried out. The sound of it was enormous. It rang across the young world like the splitting of something that had always seemed unsplittable. Blood fell. Some of it fell into the sea far below. Some of it fell upon the earth, upon Gaia herself, and where it touched her, it sank in and was held. Cronus flung what the sickle had taken out over the dark water. For a moment the world was only the sound of waves receiving it. Then Uranus was gone, retreated upward, wounded and diminished, his great body pulling back toward the high vault of the sky, away from the earth he had pressed against for so long. He would remain there. He would not descend again. The sky lifted. The world felt different at once. Gaia felt it through every root and stone, the weight that had been laid over her for so long, that slow, oppressive closeness, withdrew. She breathed. The tale describes this as the first full breath she had drawn since the caging of her children. It moved through her in a long, slow wave, from the deep rock to the surface, from the roots of the mountains to the open plains. A loosening as of something that had been bound without anyone quite noticing the binding until the binding was gone. From the drops that had fallen upon her, Gaia held something new. She did not speak of it yet. She let it rest within her, the way she let seeds rest, unhurried, knowing that what grew from blood and grief required the same patience as everything else. From the blood that struck her ground, three kinds of being would one day stir. The Erinyes, whom some call the Furies, the giants, immense and unruly, born from the same violence that had begotten so much of the world's oldest stock, and the Melii, who would emerge in the form of ash trees, quiet and tall, their roots tangled in the earth from the very beginning. None of these things rose immediately. The earth was patient. The world was still learning how to hold what had been given to it. And out on the sea, in the darkness where the waves carried the cast-off flesh of the old Sky King through the deep water, something else was beginning. The sea drew it under. The sea worked over it in the manner of cold salt water which changes what it receives. And slowly in the drift of that dark ocean something was forming that had not been asked for and could not have been predicted. Foam gathered. The way foam does, without intention, from collision and current and the particular motion of the deep. What would rise from it was not yet visible. Not yet. The tail keeps her beneath the surface for a little longer. But the sea already knew. The water had already changed around that small drifting centre of warmth. Aphrodite, though she had not yet stepped ashore, had already begun. Cronus stood on the earth with the sickle at his side. The sky above him was higher than it had ever been. The stars were further away. The cold air moved freely now, without that pressed, held quality it had carried during all the uncounted hours of Uranus's dominion. Cronus looked up at the distance and felt the open space above him, and did not look away from it for a long time. He set the sickle down. He placed it against the earth where it had come from and left it there. Some versions of the tale say Gaia took it back. Some say it remained hidden in that place, buried, its serrated edge resting in the dark, its work finished. His brothers, the tale tells us, came to him in the days that followed. Oceanus, who had encircled the world in silence during all of it, Caius down from his cold peaks, Creus, Hyperion, who had continued carrying the sun through all of it without breaking stride, because the sun does not pause for the troubles of the ground below. They came one by one or in small groups, and they looked at their youngest brother, who had done the thing they had declined to do, and they did not apologize. They simply came. And that was its own kind of acknowledgement. The Titans were free. The sky was no longer pressed down upon them. Their father's presence had withdrawn to a high and distant place from which he could watch but no longer hold. They gathered together, and, for a little while, the tale describes something that sounds very much like stillness. Not the held, waiting stillness of the night before the act, a different kind. The stillness that comes after, when the motion that has been building for a long time is finally spent, and the world rests in what it has become. Cronus would take his place at the centre of what followed. He would stand at the head of the Titans, at the summit of Mount Othrys, which rose in the south, and would become their stronghold through all the years of their reign. He would rule not as Uranus had ruled, pressed down upon everything, heavy with proximity, but as something more elevated, more distant, watching, keeping. Rhea would stand beside him. She who was gentle in the particular way that deep things are gentle, with a patience that had nothing in it of weakness, and out on the sea. The foam was still moving. Whatever it carried was drifting toward a shore. Slowly, the way a gift arrives when no one sent for it. Born on the water, unhurried, moving in the rhythm of the tide that had existed since the first waters found their motion. The tale does not name the shore yet. It simply says she was coming. And the world, fractured and changed and breathing for the first time in its long life, was waiting for her without knowing it. The years of the Golden Age settled over the world the way good weather does, without announcement, without anyone marking the moment it began. Cronus ruled from Othrys. Rhea stood beside him, and for a long stretch of time that the poets speak of with a kind of ache, the world was quiet in the best of ways. Mortals moved across the earth without the weight of winter. The ground gave what it held without being asked. No one sharpened iron against iron. No one built walls to keep other people out. The tale names this age golden not because the light was different, but because the grief had not yet arrived. Cronus and Rhea were not distant from one another in those early years. They had ruled together from the beginning, two voices that agreed more often than they did not. Rhea understood the weight Cronus carried, the memory of what had been done, the cold space of the newly lifted sky above Othrys on clear nights. She did not ask him to speak of it. She simply remained near, and her nearness was the kind that does not require explanation. He, in turn, knew the depth of her. She was not soft in the way that bends easily under pressure. She was patient the way stone is patient, the way mountains wait without impatience for the slow business of the world to reach them. Cronus had done a thing that required a certain hardness, and Rhea did not mistake hardness for unkindness. For a long time they fit together well. Then Hestia was born. The tale says very little about that first birth. It says Rhea brought her to Cronus, and Cronus took her and swallowed her. It was the prophecy. That is the reason the tellers give, and it is the reason Cronus gave himself, that before Uranus had withdrawn to his high vault he had spoken, that one of Cronus's own children would do to him what he had done to his father. The prophecy was not invented. It was not a story Cronus's fear had written in the dark, it had been spoken. And Cronus, who had seen a prophecy fulfilled with his own hands, understood that such things do not stay merely as words, so he swallowed Hestia. Rhea did not weep in the manner of mortals. She was a Titan, and her grief was immense and quiet, the way deep water is quiet at the surface while moving very fast below. She did not argue with Cronus. She looked at the place where her daughter had been, and she held the shape of what was gone, and she said nothing. The world continued. Demeter came next, then Hera. Each time Rhea brought the child to Cronus, because what else was there to do? The world had no mechanism yet for the thing she needed. There was no one to appeal to, no court above Cronus to hear her case. He was the king of the Titans, the highest point the world reached, and the prophecy was real. She understood his fear. That is the cruelest part of the tale, the part that some tellers linger over and others pass quickly. Rhea understood why he did what he did. She could trace the shape of his reasoning and find no error in it. A prophecy fulfilled once will be fulfilled again. He had seen the truth of cyclical ruin with his own hands. He was not wrong to be afraid, but understanding a thing does not make it bearable. After Hera, something changed in the space between them, not loudly. There was no break, no moment where one could say, "There, that is where it ended." It was subtler than that. The way a river changes course, not overnight but over many seasons, the water finding a slightly different path each day, until one morning the old channel is dry and the new one is deep. They continued to stand together on Othrys. They continued to speak. But Rhea had begun to hold something apart from Cronus, a small interior space that was entirely her own. Not resentment exactly, not yet. Something closer to a separate knowing. The gradual understanding that the thing they had built together had, at its foundation, a flaw neither of them could repair by agreement alone. The tale notes that Cronus was not unmoved. He watched Rhea with the careful attention of someone who knows a change is occurring and cannot stop it. He recognized what was being lost. A man who has done what Cronus did in the name of preservation does not perform his actions lightly, and he carries the weight of them, even if he does not say so. The stillness he wore in those years had more than one layer to it. There was the stillness of a ruler, and beneath that, the stillness of someone who had made a choice and lived inside its consequences each day. Hades came. Poseidon followed. 5 children swallowed. 5 absences that gathered in Rhea like weather gathers, not visible until it is too close to avoid. She began to go to places on the earth that were her own. Away from Othrys, away from the halls where Cronus kept his vigil. She walked the mountains, the old places her mother Gaia had made in the deep time before even the Titans were born. And perhaps on those walks she listened. The tale suggests she did. That the earth was not silent to her, that Gaia, vast and patient beneath her feet, was waiting for the right moment to speak. There is a version of events that says Rhea knew before Poseidon was swallowed that something would have to change, that she had already begun, quietly, to look for a way, not a weapon, not a war, something older than both. The kind of quiet resistance that does not announce itself until it is already in motion. The bond between Rhea and Cronus was not simply broken. It was redirected. What had flowed between them, that deep titanic understanding, had not vanished. It had turned. In Rhea, it had turned toward what had been lost. Toward the 5 children held inside the dark of their father's body, still divine, still whole, waiting in the manner of seeds in cold ground. She carried the 6th pregnancy in silence. She let Cronus believe nothing was different. She stood beside him on Othrys and spoke in the ordinary cadences of their long years together, and all the while she was planning the only thing she had ever planned entirely alone. The tale does not tell us what Cronus felt in those final months, whether he sensed a change in Rhea's silence, or whether he was too occupied with his own watching, his own vigil over a sky that would not come down again, his own carrying of the thing he had done. What the tale tells us is this: when the time came, Rhea did not go to Cronus. She went instead to the earth, to Gaia. To the deep and patient voice that had known this moment was coming long before either of them had been born, and so Rhea went down, not to a temple, not to an altar built by careful hands. She went to a place where the mountain opened into the earth, a fold of stone and root and darkness that smelled of rain from 100,000 years ago. The kind of place that has no name because naming it would make it smaller than it is. She did not call out. She simply arrived, and knelt, and pressed both palms flat against the ground. The tale says that Gaia answered, not in words precisely. The communication between a Titan and the earth that bore her does not pass through language in the way that mortal speech does. It is older than that. Closer to the way a bone knows when it has healed, or the way a root finds water in darkness, without instruction, without error. Rhea felt the answer move up through her palms and into her chest, and she sat with it for a long time in the silence of that stone fold, while the golden age continued above her, unbothered and unaware. What Gaia told her, the tale preserves in fragments. There are versions that speak plainly, that say Gaia instructed Rhea to go to Crete, to a cave on a high island, where the sea would hide the sound of a child's first cry. There are other versions that say the instruction came gradually, over several visits, delivered in the patient grammar of deep earth, one root's worth of meaning at a time. What all the versions agree on is this: the conversation began with the prophecy. Not as Cronus had received it. He had received it from his dying father, Uranus, a curse spoken in the last rage of a king who had already lost. The words had carried all the bitterness of that moment. They had entered Cronus as a wound, and he had carried them that way ever since, a carried injury that never fully closed. That shaped every choice he made from that day forward. Gaia gave the prophecy to Rhea differently. She gave it without bitterness, because the earth does not feel bitterness in the way rulers do. She gave it as a description of what was already true. A child of Cronus would rise. The line would turn on itself again. The wheel of succession, which Cronus himself had set in motion when he brought the sickle down on his father, was still turning. It had not stopped. It would not stop simply because Cronus wished it to. Rhea listened to this. She held it against the prophecy she already knew, the one Cronus held like a wound, and she found the difference between them. He had heard a threat. The earth was telling her of a pattern, and patterns, unlike threats, can be moved within, worked with, carried toward a different outcome without being broken. This, the tale suggests, is where Rhea's plan truly began, not in anger, not even in hope quite, in the understanding that what Cronus feared was real, and that the only way to move through it was to find the shape inside the fear that was not yet fixed. Above ground, on Othrys, Cronus sat in the manner he had sat for years. He was not idle. A Titan king does not idle. He received the reports of his Titan kin, the movements of Oceanus at the world's rim, the daily transit of Hyperion carrying the sun across the sky, the steady governance of a world in its golden age. Nothing had broken, nothing had shifted. The mortals in their valleys lived their quiet days, knew no winter, felt no hunger. All of it moved smoothly beneath his keeping. And yet, there was a thing Cronus watched more closely than any of this, a thing he did not speak of aloud and did not permit himself to name directly, because to name it would make it more real. He watched the sky. Not for weather, not for the movements of the stars as tools of navigation or calculation. He watched the sky the way a person watches a door they are not sure is locked. The prophecy from Uranus had been specific in its shape, if not its detail, a child of his own line. An overthrow that mirrored his own. He had done everything in his power to prevent it, had made himself into the vessel that contained the danger, had swallowed 5 divine children and kept them within him, safe from the world, and the world safe from them, and still the watching did not ease. This is one of the things the tale holds quietly, without drawing too much attention to it. Power obtained by a single decisive act does not become stable simply because the act was successful. Cronus knew this in the way a person knows something they have never spoken. He had taken the throne in a night of darkness and stone. He had not inherited it, had not been given it through any ceremony of consent. He had taken it, and there was a difference between those two things that no amount of Golden Age abundance could fully paper over. His grip on power was a tight one because he had learned from his own example. What happened to a grip that loosened? And so he held, and waited, and the sky remained as it had always remained. Below him, in the fold of stone, Rhea was still. She had received what she came for. Not a plan in its full shape, not yet. A direction. A confirmation that the prophecy was not the end of the sentence, that beyond what Uranus had cursed, there was another clause that had not yet been spoken aloud. Something was coming that Cronus's watching and holding and swallowing could not stop, because it was not arriving through any door he had thought to lock. The 6th child moved in her. A small and insistent presence, already distinct from the 5 who had come before. Rhea rose from the stone fold. She set her palms once more against the ground, briefly, in the manner of someone who has received a gift and knows it. Then she walked back toward the light, and the mountain above her did not change its posture. And the air in the Golden Age remained warm and unbothered. She returned to Othrys before evening. She stood beside Cronus in the hall where the Titans received the reports of the world. She spoke in her ordinary voice. She watched the light move across the floor of the hall in the way it had moved across that floor for years. Cronus looked at her once with the careful attention that had become habitual in him. He found nothing different in her face. He looked away. The tale notes. In the way it notes things, it wishes the listener to hold on to without fully understanding yet. That there was something already present in that hall which neither Cronus nor Rhea could perceive directly. Not a figure, not a sound. Something more like a shadow that a future object cast backward through time, arriving before the thing itself. The stone that would one day be wrapped in cloth rested somewhere in the earth, uncut and patient. The cave on the high island waited in the dark of the sea, and in the depth of Cronus's own body 5 children pressed against the inside of their father's keeping. Still divine, still whole, still waiting for the moment the walls gave way. The time came without announcement. That is how the tale tells it. No storm broke over Othrys. No omen moved through the hall where Cronus received his reports. The Golden Age continued in its familiar abundance, and the mortals in their valleys woke to the same warm light they had always known. Nothing outside shifted. But Rhea knew. The sixth child had moved differently that morning. A settling rather than a turning. The small and insistent presence she had carried through the months of her keeping had arrived at a new kind of stillness. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of readiness. She did not go to Cronus. This is the moment the tale marks with care, because it is quiet enough to miss. Rhea had stood beside her consort through 5 births. She had placed each child in his arms in the manner of a mother offering a gift. She had watched him receive them, and she had not looked away, because to look away would have been to acknowledge that she had foreseen what she could not stop. She had stood there and looked at his face instead, finding in it the thing she had not wanted to find, not cruelty. Something older than cruelty, fear that had become habit. Fear that had made itself into love of a kind, the way a man who holds a door shut long enough begins to believe he is protecting the room. She did not go to Cronus this time. She went to the earth, not the fold of stone beneath the mountain, which was a place of receiving. This was different. This was a going outward, a crossing of the ground between what was and what was needed. The tale does not name the road Rhea walked. It only says she walked it before the light changed, while the day was still full and unhurried, and that she moved in the manner of someone who had decided. Gaia was not a place to arrive at. The tale has already said this, in the way things already said can bear repeating. Gaia was the ground itself, the deep patience of stone, the old knowing that passes through root and water without requiring ears to receive it. And Rhea, who had been a daughter of that ground before she was a consort of Othris, found what she was looking for the way a river finds the sea, not by searching. By inclining, she pressed her palms flat, and the earth answered. What passed between them the tale does not translate into spoken counsel or divine instruction. There were no words carved into stone, no voice rising from a fissure. There was a knowing that moved upward through the clay and into Rhea's open hands. The way a healer will press a palm to injured ground and feel, without being told, the direction of the break. What Rhea understood was this. There was an island, high and edged with sea wind, its cliffs dropping to water the colour of deepened sky. The island had a cave within it, a place of interior silence where sound went inward rather than outward, where the stone held quiet, the way stone will hold the memory of warmth after a fire has died. The cave had been waiting, not waiting for her. Waiting in the manner that all necessary things wait, without impatience, without knowledge of what they are holding themselves in readiness for, simply there. Simply ready, she would go there. The child would be born there, and the child would remain there, hidden in that interior silence. While she returned, she would need a stone. This too was not an instruction given in words. It arrived in her palms the way the rest had arrived. A shape, a weight, a clear and simple understanding of what the exchange required. Not a wound and not a deception in the way the tale might later be misread. A necessity. The prophecy moved through its pattern, and within the pattern there was a seam where the shape of things could be shifted without breaking the whole. Cronus would receive what he expected to receive, and what he expected would not be what it was. Rhea rose from the ground in the manner of someone who has taken on a weight, not a burden but a carrying. The kind that holds the one who carries as much as it is held. She returned to Othris. She moved through the hall in her ordinary way. She said what she ordinarily said. The evening reports came in from the furthest edges of the world. Oceanus had not shifted at the rim. Hyperion had carried the sun in its expected arc and handed the day back to the dark. The mortals in their valleys had slept. All of it ordinary. Cronus watched her in his customary way. He found her face settled and familiar. He did not ask what she had done in the hours before evening. He did not know there was a question to ask. This is the seam the tale points to, gently, without emphasis. Not the lie that was coming, what was already true that Cronus had never looked at directly. He had spent years watching the sky for the thing that would undo him. He had watched every door he could name. What he had not watched was the ground beneath him, the patient and unhurried earth that had taught his own consort how to carry a fear without being broken by it. Gaia had set the shape of everything before him, before Cronus, before the sickle, before the golden age and its warm light and its silent mortals. She had borne Uranus and felt him pressed against her. She had fashioned a blade from her own body's stone. She had sent her youngest son into the dark to do what she could not do directly. She had survived that and the age that followed. And the grief of children swallowed and children imprisoned, and a world that moved along the surface of her suffering without knowing what it rested on. What Gaia had given Rhea was not a strategy. It was the longer knowing, that a mother who has survived long enough learns the ground inside the sorrow, learns to move along it without announcing her movement. The sixth child waited. Rhea waited. And Othrys sat in its high place above the warm golden age, still and apparently undisturbed, while below its stone the earth kept its own counsel, and the uncut stone in some nameless hillside lay exactly where it had always lain. Undiscovered, patient, already shaped by what it was about to become. The cave on Crete held its silence. The sea around that island moved in its ordinary way, drawing sound outward away from the high cliffs into the wide open water where it dissolved before it could carry any message worth hearing. The world, the tale tells us, was very quiet. It often is in the moments before what changes everything. The change, when it came, was not announced. Rhea did not take her leave of Othrys with speeches or visible grief. There were no torches gathered, no provisions packed in plain sight. She moved the way water moves through limestone, finding the path of least resistance, wearing it quietly over time until the passage was simply there. The child was born on Crete. The tale does not linger on the journey itself. What it preserves is the arrival, the high cliffs and the cold salt wind coming off the water. The sea below, dark and vast, pulling sound away from the island the way it had always done, and within the island's interior, the cave. The one the earth had shown her through the knowing in her palms. She crossed its threshold in the manner of someone entering a place already familiar. Not because she had been there before, because the cave was exactly what it had promised to be. Interior silence, stone that held warmth, a space where nothing would be heard from outside, and where what happened inside would remain inside, held as the stone held everything it was given to hold. She laid the child down. He was breathing. That was the first fact. He breathed, and the cave breathed with him. The second fact was this: he was alive, and Cronus did not know it, and the stone wrapped in cloth was already waiting on Othrys. Already prepared, already held close and ordinary seeming by the hands that would carry it up to the throne room at the expected hour, Rhea remained on Crete long enough for the knowing to settle in her. The kind of knowing that does not come from being told, but from having done a thing and finding oneself still standing afterward. She pressed her hand to the cave floor once, flat-palmed, the way she had pressed it to the ground outside Othrys. The stone gave back only its own quiet. Cold, and very old, and sufficient. She left. The child remained, and the cave closed around him the way the sea closes over a stone dropped into deep water. Not violently, simply completely. The ones the tale calls the curates arrived not long after. They are described differently in different tellings. Sometimes as warrior priests, sometimes as young men who had been waiting on those hillsides for exactly this purpose, without knowing it the way the cave had waited. What the tellings agree on is the shields. They had them. Bronze, wide, heavy enough to ring when struck. and they struck them there on Mount Ida above the cave in a rhythm that was not chaotic but patterned. Regular as the arc Hyperion traced across the sky each day, the sound of it descended the mountainside and broke apart against the rock faces before it could travel further. What reached the sea was not sound at all, but a kind of pressure, a vibration that the water took in without comment. Below, in the cave, the child cried. The curetes clashed their shields again. The cry rose and was taken by the bronze and the shouting and the rhythm of all those feet moving in their deliberate dance on the mountainside above. None of it reached Cronus, not the cry, not the bronze, not the infant breath warming the stone floor of that cave with its first hours of existence. Cronus sat in his hall at Othryss, with the world's reports arriving at dusk as they had always arrived, Oceanus at the rim, Hyperion's arc completed, the mortals sleeping. He received all of it in his customary way. He found nothing in it worth alarm. The tale marks this with a stillness that is almost tender. Cronus, the youngest and sharpest of the Titans, who had studied the face of catastrophe until he could recognize it in the tilt of a cloud, who had kept the Cyclopes sealed in Tartarus because he understood the shape of a threat before it arrived, who had watched every door and every sky edge and every approaching figure for a sign of the thing that would undo him, he did not look down. Below his mountain the earth continued. Amalthea moved across the slopes of Mount Ida. She was a goat, and the tale does not attribute speech to her, or intention in any human sense. What it preserves is this: she gave what she had to give, without withholding, and the child grew because of it. Her milk was not ordinary milk, or if it was ordinary, then ordinary things are more powerful than they are usually credited with being. The child drank, and the child grew. That is the mechanism the tale records without elaborating. The curetes kept their watch. Day following day on that high island, the shields rang out, and the infant cries were swallowed by bronze and mountain wind, and the world went on believing nothing was beginning. The Golden Age continued as it had since Cronus took the sky throne. The mortals in their valleys lived without grief, or so the later telling goes. The seasons moved in easy cycles. No one built walls. No one sharpened weapons. The earth provided without being demanded of, and what was given was enough, and the mortals who received it did not yet know what scarcity was or what it felt like when the world withheld. They did not know. The tale observes gently, because the thing that would end their ease was already breathing in a cave above the sea, growing in the dark and the quiet, fed by a goat's generosity and shielded by the rhythm of bronze on bronze. There is a wound the story carries through all of this without naming directly. It is the wound of what Cronus had done to himself without understanding it as a wound. He had swallowed 5 children to prevent the prophecy. He had believed the swallowing was the prevention, but the prophecy did not live in any of the 5. It lived in the pattern beneath the prophecy, the pattern that said power taken by force and held by fear and secured by eating what one loves will always generate the thing it fears. Cronus had not removed the danger, he had fed it, given it cause, given it shape, given it a name in the grief of a mother who had learned from the oldest mother how to move without being seen. The 6th child grew. The curetes clashed their shields again on the mountainside. Amalthea moved through the morning light, heavy with the milk she would give, and the cave held its silence in the way the tale has said it held things. The way stone holds the memory of warmth after a fire has died, not releasing it, not advertising it, simply keeping it inside, patient and interior. Waiting without knowing it was waiting for the moment when what it carried would walk out into the open air and become what it was made to be. That moment had not yet arrived. The child was still small, still new, still held entirely within the parentheses of that cave's dark and that island's high indifferent wind. But the story knows what Cronus did not know. that on the slope above the cave. The rhythm of bronze was already writing the first line of the age that would follow his. The years passed on Crete, the way years pass in places where no one is counting them. The sun rose over the eastern water, and Hyperion drew it across the sky in his accustomed arc, and it descended again into the western sea. And the island accepted this without ceremony. The cave received each darkness and released it again at dawn. The child inside it grew. What the tale preserves of this growing is not a list of seasons but a shape, a progression from something entirely enclosed and dependent to something that stood upright and moved through the world with intention. Zeus did not remain an infant forever. That is the plain fact the story carries forward. The cave that had held him in his first smallness eventually became a place he could leave. He left it. The slopes of Mount Ida received him in the same way they received everything, without ceremony, without comment. He walked them as any young figure walks a hillside, learning the particular resistance of the ground, the way the wind comes up from one direction in the morning and shifts by afternoon. He learned the island the way something learns a place, by being in it, through the feet and the hands and the cold air entering the lungs. Amalthea was still there, moving through the high grass. The curettes still kept their vigil on the slopes above the cave, though the shields were quieter now. Their purpose had changed shape along with the child. What had once been urgent concealment had become something more like a standing watch. They remained, and the tale preserves them as remaining, loyal to the arrangement Gaia and Rhea had put in place. Faithful to the function they had been given without being told when it would end. Cronus, on his throne at Othrys, continued to receive the world at dusk. He did not know what was standing on the slopes of Mount Ida and looking out at the sea. The tale is careful about this. It does not rush the moment of Cronus's knowledge. It allows the god on Crete to grow into the full dimension of what he would become before the world was asked to reckon with him. This is the patience the story practices in its older tellings. The patience of a narrative that understands timing. That understands a thing must be whole before it can be useful. Zeus was whole now, or as whole as he would need to be. Metis came to him in the way wisdom sometimes arrives, not announced, not decorated with signs. She was a daughter of Oceanus, of the great encircling river that bordered the world, and she carried in her nature the quality of deep water, calm on the surface, complex beneath it. The tale names her the goddess of counsel and cunning, and says she was among the wisest of the beings who moved through the world before the Olympians fully assumed their shape. She had been watching. She knew what Cronus had done. She knew what the five swallowed gods were and where they were. She knew the shape of the problem that needed solving, and she brought to Zeus not only the solution, but the vessel for the solution, a preparation. Something bitter and ancient, compounded from things that caused the body to reject what it had taken in. The tale does not linger on the particulars of the preparation. What it records is the effect. Before the effect, there was the approach. Zeus could not arrive at Othrys as himself. That much was plain. Cronus watched every approaching figure, had done so for the length of his reign, and the face of a grown child he had no knowledge of possessing would have resolved itself into a threat before any word was spoken. So the approach required a different shape, a servant shape, a face that carried no history, no weight, nothing that would make Cronus look twice. The disguise was prepared. The tale is told differently in different mouths, and the details shift depending on who is speaking. Some say Metis accompanied Zeus to the court at Othrys and moved through it with him, present but unseen in the way that counsel is often present but unseen. Others say she prepared everything in advance and sent Zeus forward alone with the preparation sealed in an unremarkable container. What the versions agree on is this. Zeus entered the hall of Cronus without being recognized. He took a place among the servants, the attendants, the figures who moved through the periphery of a king's attention without ever entering the centre of it. Othrys was a mountain built by certainty. The hall within it carried the weight of a long reign, the particular heaviness of a place that has not needed to question itself in some time. Cronus sat at the centre of it with the authority of a god who has held his throne since before the mortals in their valleys learned to name what they feared. His eyes were the eyes of a sovereign, and they moved across every arriving figure with the automatic calculation of a mind that has never stopped watching for threat. He looked at the new servant. He found nothing there that required his attention. Zeus moved through the hall in the careful way a figure moves through a place that must not notice them. He learned the rhythms of the court, when food was carried, when wine was poured, when the moment arrived in which a cup passed from one hand to another without comment, absorbed into the ordinary movement of a hall that believed it was entirely safe. Metis had prepared the emetic well. The preparation entered the wine, and the wine was carried forward, and Cronus received it in the way Cronus received all things in his hall, as his due, as a routine offering from the world that served him. He drank without examining what he was drinking. What followed was not slow. The tale records it plainly, without embellishment, as if the plainness is itself the proper register for a moment of this magnitude. A shudder moved through Cronus. Then another. The body does not negotiate with certain substances. It simply responds with a totality that bypasses will and dignity and the long, careful constructions of a sovereign intelligence. He vomited up the stone first. The stone that Rhea had wrapped in swaddling cloth and carried to Othrys with steady hands and a grief held below the surface. The stone that Cronus had taken without looking closely, because he had never looked closely at love or grief or the things that were offered to him from below. It came up hard and cold and landed on the floor of the hall with a sound the tale says was heard at the edges of the room. Then the five came. Hestia first, as she had been swallowed first. The story preserves the order. She emerged not as an infant, but whole, steady, already carrying in her bearing the quality of the hearth she would one day embody. Warmth gathered to a centre, a stillness around which other things could orient themselves. She stood in the hall of Othrys, and the hall did not know what to do with her. Then Demeter, with the deep patience of things that grow. Then Hera, precise and proud, eyes already moving across the room with the intelligence of a being who has been held in the dark and has no intention of remaining there. Then Hades, grave and quiet, carrying with him the particular quality of stillness that deepens rather than settles. Then Poseidon, whose first act upon emerging was to draw a breath so full it seemed to take something from the room, 5 of them. Standing in the hall of their father's court, Cronus looked at them and understood what he was looking at. The tale does not record what he said in that moment, if he said anything at all. It records instead the silence of the hall, the particular quality of a silence that descends on a place when the thing that has been feared has finally arrived and is already standing inside the room. Zeus was already moving toward the door. The 5 followed. The hall of Othrys held its silence behind them. The stone that had been a substitute child lay on the floor where it had fallen, cold and dense and unremarkable. The navel of a deception that had lasted through 5 children and 1 reign and 1 long unbroken arc of fear. It would be moved in time to a place the world would call the centre. But that was still ahead, for now it rested on the floor of the court, and the court stood empty of the things it had held, and the night outside the mountain was very still. And somewhere on the slopes of Crete, Amalthea moved through the dark grass, and the curettes sat quiet above a cave that no longer needed to hide anything. The mountain of Othrys did not fall that night. This is something the tale is careful to preserve. The hall emptied. The court stood silent. Cronus remained on his throne, surrounded by the particular ruin of a certainty that has been broken from the inside, but the mountain itself stood, as it had always stood, dark against the sky. its stones unchanged, its summit still wrapped in the cold air of a long authority. What changed was the air inside it. A court that has lost the thing it was built to contain does not immediately understand what it has become. The servants move through the hall with the habitual care of people who have learned not to see too much. The torches continued to burn. The bronze fixtures caught the light as they had always caught it. But the quality of the room had shifted in some way that the tale describes only by its effect, the way a held breath changes the character of a space, even after the breath is finally released. Cronus looked at the door through which his children had walked. Then he looked at the stone on the floor. Then he called for his brothers. They say the summons went out before the night was fully old. Caius and Creus, Hyperion and Iapetus, the Titan lords who had ruled beside Cronus through the long years of the Golden Age and the longer years of their father's imprisonment before that. They came to Othrys with the measured speed of beings who have been waiting for something without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. The tale says very little about what was spoken in those first councils. What it records is the outcome. The Titans gathered at Othrys. They took their positions on the mountain and around it, settling into the high places with the weight of beings who know that a mountain well held is a war half won. They were not unprepared for conflict. They were ancient enough to understand that the prophecy had spoken truly, and that understanding a prophecy does not prevent its fulfillment so much as determine the shape of one's response to it. Cronus's response was to close the mountain and hold it. Across the divide of the world, Zeus and his 5 siblings made their way to Olympus. The tales differ on whether this movement was swift or gradual, whether the 6 crossed the distance in a single night or gathered themselves slowly over many days. Travelling through a world that was still the world of the Golden Age, its fields still full and its rivers still clear, its mortals still living in the unclouded quiet that Cronus's long reign had produced. The world did not yet know it was about to become a different world. Olympus received them. It was not a mountain that had been prepared. The tale does not speak of walls already standing or thrones already placed. It was simply the highest peak, the place from which the sky came closest to the earth, and Zeus chose it, the way a figure of that kind chooses a position. Not with calculation exactly, but with the instinct of one who was made to stand in high places and look outward. The 5 settled on the slopes around him, each of them carrying still the quality they had carried out of the hall of Othrys, Hestia with her gathered stillness, Demeter with her patient gravity, Hera with her precise and attentive intelligence, already reading the terrain the way she would spend an age reading the courts and councils of the divine world. Hades quiet in the way of deep places, Poseidon with a restlessness in him like water that cannot fully stop moving even when it appears still. 6 children of Cronus, standing on the mountain that would hold their name. But they were not alone, and here the tale widens to include what is perhaps the most quietly remarkable moment of those early days before the war had properly begun. Among the Titans, there were 2 who did not go to Othrys. Prometheus and Epimetheus, sons of Iapetus, stood at a point of division that the tale records with a careful attention. They were Titans by birth and lineage, as ancient as the others, their father having stood among the 12 in the age when the cosmos first took its shape under Cronus and Rhea. They carried all the nature of their kind, the great age, the elemental weight, the knowledge that comes from being woven into the fabric of existence from its earliest days. Prometheus, the tale tells us, saw forward. This is the quality the stories always assign him, and it is worth attending to. Not prophecy exactly, but a peculiar clarity about the way causes gather into consequences. He had watched the accumulation of events with the eyes of one who counts what is passing rather than simply experiencing it. He had seen Cronus swallow his children. He had seen the stone vomited up and the 5 gods emerging in the hall where they had never been expected to stand. He had looked at both mountains, at Othrys with its closed certainty, and at Olympus with its 6 newly arrived and unhoused divinities, and he had understood something that the tale does not reduce to a single sentence. He walked away from Othrys. Epimetheus walked with him, as he would walk with his brother through all the ages that followed. The two of them moving in opposite directions through time itself, one always looking ahead, one always arriving a moment after the relevant conclusion. They came to Olympus. The tale records this as a simple arrival, two figures crossing the distance between the two mountains, leaving behind the place where their father's generation had gathered to stand. What it meant for the war that was coming, the tale does not immediately say. It lets the arrival settle first, the way significant things require a moment of simple presence before their weight can be measured. Zeus received them, and so the two sides took their shape. On Othrys, the Titan lords with the long solidity of the ruling age behind them, the mountain stone beneath their feet. The certainty of a reign that had held the world in peace and abundance, now turned defensive, now sharpened into something that peace had never needed to be, on Olympus. 6 gods who had been swallowed and returned, 2 Titans who had crossed the divide, and Zeus at the center of it. The youngest born of Rhea's children, in order of emergence, though the first to have breathed free air on the island of Crete. The world lay between the two mountains, unaware of what was being decided above it. Its rivers moved through their valleys. Its mortals, still living in the last light of the Golden Age, worked their fields and slept in their houses without walls, under skies that had not yet learned to carry war in them. Somewhere on Crete, Amalthea moved through the high grass of the slopes, and the curettes sat above the empty cave with their bronze shields across their knees, doing nothing in particular, which is what guardians do when the thing they guarded has grown and gone forward into its own life. The stone on the floor of Othrys lay where it had fallen, cold and dense, the navel of a deception that had been made from love and grief and the particular intelligence of a mother who understood that survival sometimes requires offering a king what he expects to receive. It would be moved, eventually, to a place the world would call its center, but the war would have to be fought first, and the war had not yet begun. For now, 2 mountains faced each other across the body of the world, and the tail. Having brought them to this position, pauses here. The way a breath pauses before it becomes something. It is said that before the first blow of the Titanomachy was ever struck, before thunder existed as anything more than sky sound, Zeus made a descent. This is the moment the tale calls the turning, not the war itself, not the final assault that would drive the Titans from their mountain, but the journey downward into the place beneath the world, where something had been imprisoned since before Cronus had taken his first throne. Gaia counselled him. The tales are consistent on this point. She came to him not in a vision or through the medium of priests, but the way the earth always speaks, through the soles of feet, through the particular stillness of ground that has something to say. Zeus felt it on Olympus, that low steady presence rising through the mountain stone, and he understood it as counsel, the way a navigator understands wind. She told him what lay in Tartarus. He knew the name. He knew it the way all beings of that age knew it, as the utterance for the place beneath everything, the dark beneath the dark, the floor of the world below the world's floor. He knew it carried the Cyclopes. He knew it carried the Hecatoncheires. He knew they had been imprisoned since the age when Uranus had looked upon the children Gaia bore him and found them unbearable, and had pressed them downward rather than endure them. What he did not yet know entirely was what their presence there would mean when removed. He made the descent alone. The tale notes this plainly. He did not take his siblings, did not take Prometheus, did not bring the restless energy of Poseidon or the cold intelligence of Hades. He went as the one who had been hidden on Crete, as the one who had slipped into Cronus's court in disguise, as the one whose nature had always been to move where the moment required rather than to announce the movement first. Down he went, past the roots of Olympus, past the lower depths where rivers begin their first dark passages, past the stone that holds the world's weight. into the region where light does not arrive and time moves differently, gathering mass rather than duration. Tartarus was not a place built by hands. The tale is careful about this. It was not a dungeon constructed according to any plan. It was the original depth, the first beneath, the zone Hesiod's verse would later describe as the distance a falling anvil travels in 9 days before reaching bottom. It existed before walls had been conceived. The walls that Uranus had placed around the imprisoned were not built from stone or iron, but from restraint itself, from the force of a will pressed down upon living things so old that time barely touched them. Brontes was there, and Steropes, and Argus. The 3 Cyclopes, each carrying in the single eye at the centre of the brow a brightness that had not been extinguished by the years of their confinement. They were the smiths of lightning, the tales say, meaning they carried the knowledge of what fire becomes when it is gathered into its highest form, when it is shaped by hands that understand both heat and purpose. They had been there since the world's first age, held in the dark with their knowing intact, waiting in the specific stillness of beings who cannot make a thing with their hands because their hands are bound. The Hecatoncheires were further in, Cottus, and Briareos, and Gyges. The tale pauses on their proportions with a kind of reverence that does not require exaggeration, because what they were did not require it. 50 heads each, 100 arms apiece. Beings of such accumulated mass that their presence in Tartarus was not simply a confinement, but a compression, something of enormous weight held in a space that strained at its own edges simply by containing them. They were not asleep. This is what the tale wants to be understood. They had not surrendered to the dark or grown dim from waiting. They were awake in Tartarus, as they had been awake when Uranus pressed them down. As they had been awake through the rule of Cronus, who had kept the gates sealed rather than risk what releasing them might mean. Zeus broke the chains. The tale does not dwell on the mechanics of this. There is no extended account of wrestling with iron or of divine force applied against ancient restraint. What it records is the act itself, the decision made and then enacted, the gesture of release. He broke the chains of the Cyclopes first, and then the bonds of the Hecatoncheires, and the sound of that breaking, the tale suggests, moved through Tartarus the way a first word moves through a room that has been silent too long. The freed beings looked at the one who had come down to them. Brontes regarded him, Steropes regarded him. Argus, whose name the tales sometimes render as brightness, regarded him with that single eye that had held the knowledge of lightning shaping through all the years of the dark. And the Cyclopes gave what they had, not from obligation, the tale is precise here, from gratitude, which is a different thing from the particular fullness of beings who have held a craft inside them for an age and have been given at last the means to offer it. They forged the thunderbolt. In the depths of Tartarus, with their hands freed and their knowledge intact, they made the thing that had not yet existed in the world above. A weapon that was not simply a weapon, but the solidification of sky itself, the visible shape of the authority that Zeus carried without yet having the instrument to make that authority legible. The bolt was light made heavy, brightness borrowed from the highest place and given weight, given edge. Given the capacity to travel from the hand that threw it to whatever it met, Zeus received it. The tale records the moment without ceremony. He received the thunderbolt in his hands, and the thing rested there as though it had been made to do precisely that. There were 2 more to consider. When Zeus brought the freed Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires up from Tartarus, the making did not stop at one gift. The Cyclopes understood that what was being prepared was not a single god's victory, but a division of the world among those who would hold it, and they shaped accordingly. For Poseidon, the trident, 3-tined, designed for the hand of one whose nature moved like water, whose restlessness required an instrument as capable of stillness as of force. The trident was the thing that would give Poseidon's authority over the sea its legible form, the tool through which the depths would answer when called, for Hades the helm. The helmet of darkness. The thing the tale describes with a particular care, because it was not a weapon in the way the others were weapons. It was concealment. It was the capacity to move through the world without being seen by it, to be present in a space without registering as presence. It suited the one who would rule what cannot be looked at directly, the one whose quietness on the slopes of Olympus already had the quality of deep places. 3 brothers. 3 instruments. The tale does not lose sight of the Hecatoncheires in this account. They rose from Tartarus with their 100 arms, and their 50 heads, and their full undiminished force. And they took their place among the Olympians' allies with the unhurried gravity of beings who have been waiting long enough that urgency no longer applies to them. What they would do when the war came was already written in what they were, but the war was not yet come. Zeus carried the thunderbolt back up through the dark levels, past the rivers, past the roots of mountains, back into the air of the world above, where Olympus waited and the Titans had not yet moved from Othrys. He stood again on the high peak. The bolt rested in his hand. Below, the world's mortals slept in their unwalled houses. The rivers continued, the fields held their grain. 2 mountains faced each other in the night, and between them the air carried the first faint trace of what was coming. The way ground shifts almost imperceptibly before something beneath it decides to move. The thunderbolt had a weight that was not entirely physical. This is something the tale returns to in the various forms it has taken across the ages of its telling. Not the weight of iron or bronze, not the heaviness of a thing lifted against gravity, but the weight of what a thing means. Zeus stood on the high peak of Olympus with the bolt in his hand and felt both kinds simultaneously, the material and the other kind. The one that settles into the bones of the one who holds something that has arrived at last into its proper place. The night around him was cold in the way of high places. Not unpleasant, simply honest. The air at the peak of Olympus did not soften itself for anyone's comfort. It was what it was, thin and clear and carrying the particular quality of altitude, the sense of being above the layer of the world where ordinary things occur. Above weather in the common sense, above the low mists that gathered over rivers and fields and the sleeping houses of mortals. He stood and looked at the bolt in his hands. The tale holds this moment longer than it might seem necessary to hold it. The war was coming. The Titans were on Othrys. There was urgency in the abstract sense. In the sense that 10 years of conflict were already coiling in the air between the 2 mountains, like a storm that had gathered all its elements and was waiting on the one remaining condition before it released itself. But the tale does not move toward urgency. It stays with the man on the peak and the thing in his hands and the stillness of the moment between receiving and using. Because the gift had a nature beyond its function, the thunderbolt was not the first weapon in the world. There had been the adamantine sickle shaped by Gaia in the time before time had settled into its current forms. The sickle that Cronus had taken and used and buried afterward, as one buries a thing whose memory is uncomfortable. There had been the instruments of Titans, forces of nature directed by intention. But those were things that predated the division of authority. They were tools of an age when power was undivided and therefore ungoverned, when the cosmos was ruled by whoever could hold it through force alone. The thunderbolt was different in kind. It was the first instrument of ordered authority. This is the distinction the tale draws. Not force employed by the strongest, but force in service of a structure, an arrangement by which the world would be apportioned and maintained. Zeus carrying the bolt was not simply Zeus carrying a weapon. It was the first visible form of the principle that the world would be held not by the most powerful single being, but by a distribution of powers, each with its proper domain, each with an instrument suited to that domain's nature. This is why the Cyclopes made 3. The tale moves now to consider the trident. It rested at that moment with its maker, waiting for the hands it had been shaped to suit. The Cyclopes had worked it with the same knowledge and the same care they had brought to the bolt, but they had worked it differently because the thing it was meant to govern was different in nature from the sky. Water does not move as sky moves. The sky is vast and tends toward the absolute, toward the single decisive gesture, the bolt that travels in one direction from one source to one destination. Water moves in layers. It has depth and surface and the slow horizontal force of current, and these 3 qualities require an instrument with 3 points of address. The tines numbered 3, not as ornament, but as argument. Each tine spoke to a different register of the sea's nature, and together they gave the one who held them access to all 3 simultaneously, the power to still the surface while the depth continued its own motion, the power to raise a wave from the flat calm, the power to reach down into the cold dark where the sea becomes something other than what its surface suggests, something older and stranger and largely indifferent to the weather above it. Poseidon, on the slopes of Olympus where he had stood since the day of the vomiting and the reunion, carried within him a quality the tale sometimes calls restlessness and sometimes calls vitality. He was not still in the way that Hades was still. He moved when he stood, shifted weight, turned his gaze from one direction to another, attended to multiple things in the same moment with the fractured attention of one whose nature was to be in motion even when the body was stationary. The trident was shaped for exactly that nature, an instrument for a hand that moved. He would receive it when the time came. The helm was the 3rd, and the tale gives it a different quality of attention than it gives the other 2. The helmet of darkness sat in the minds of those who described it as a thing almost paradoxical, because a helmet is ordinarily a visible object, a declaration of presence, a mark of the one who wears it. The helm of Hades was the inversion of this. It was a helmet that removed the wearer from the register of the visible, that allowed presence without detection. That let the one who wore it move through a space as though the space were empty even when it was not. It was the instrument of the negative, of the hidden, of the authority that operates not through visible force, but through the capacity to be where no one expects anything to be. Hades, among the 3 brothers, had always carried that quality. The tale notes this with a gentleness that is characteristic of the way it handles Hades throughout. He was not cold or cruel in the manner that later ages sometimes imagined him. He was precise. He was quiet in the particular way of those who have no need of noise to make their presence felt, who understand that the most complete forms of authority do not announce themselves. On Olympus, during the years of gathering and preparation, he had stood at the edge of councils and said little, and what he said was measured and final in a way that the words of louder gods were not. The helm suited him as the bolt suited Zeus, and the trident would suit Poseidon, not because it was assigned to him, but because it was made for him. The Cyclopes had worked it from their knowledge of what invisibility required at the divine scale, the particular craft of rendering something present but undetectable. They had made it in Tartarus, in the dark, which was perhaps appropriate. The knowledge of how to make darkness wearable had been arrived at in the place that knew darkness most intimately. 3 instruments, 3 brothers, 3 domains. The tale allows itself a moment of stillness here, a pause in which to hold all 3 simultaneously before moving forward. The bolt at the sky, the trident at the sea, the helm at the world beneath. Together they describe the entire vertical extent of the cosmos, from the highest air to the deepest water, to the realm below all water, below all earth. Where the dead went, and where something that was not quite light and not quite dark maintained the order of whatever came after life. The order of the New Age was inscribed in those 3 objects before a single battle of the Titanomachy had been resolved. This was what the Cyclopes understood, what their long craft and their long waiting and their freed hands had produced, not simply weapons. A map of the world's next arrangement, given physical form before the arrangement had been established, as though the making of the instruments was itself the act of deciding how things would be divided. Zeus felt the weight of this in the bolt he held. The cold air moved across the peak. Below, the valley between Olympus and Othrys lay in darkness, the distances between the two mountains immeasurable in any way that numbers would assist. The Titans on their mountain had their own ancient powers, the powers of the age before division, the raw elemental forces that had shaped the world in its first form. They were not weak. They would not be easily overcome, but they did not have this. They did not have the particular kind of authority that is conferred by an instrument that fits the one who holds it perfectly. That makes legible what was previously only carried internally. They had force. They had the weight of ages and the solidarity of the old order. What they did not have was the thing the Cyclopes had understood in the dark of their long captivity, that the world to come would be held not by undifferentiated power, but by apportioned dominion. Each domain governed by the one whose nature was suited to it. That understanding was what the Cyclopes had shaped into bronze and fire, and the light borrowed from the highest sky. Somewhere in the valley below, a night bird crossed between the two mountains, moving from one dark slope to another with the unconcerned ease of a creature that had no stake in the conflict gathering above it. The stars maintained their positions. The rivers in the valley continued their low conversations with their stones. Zeus closed his hand around the bolt. The weight of it was both kinds at once, the physical and the other. The weight of what it was, and the weight of what it meant. In his hand, for the first time in the world's age, the sky had a legible form, a shape that could be held and directed and released. The morning would come when it would be needed. For now the peak was quiet. The night held everything with the impartial patience it brought to all things, the gods on their mountain and the Titans on theirs. The instruments of the new age and the mortals in their fields, and the old dark of Tartarus below everything. Its chains broken, its long labour finished, the space of it settling into a different kind of silence now that what it had held for so long was no longer there to be contained. Dawn did not come immediately. The night held its position over both mountains, over the valley between them, over the mortals sleeping in their distant settlements without knowledge of what gathered on the high peaks above their world. The darkness was complete in the way of nights before fire was common, before lamps were numerous enough to scatter it. Only the stars gave light, and they gave it indifferently, as they had given it to the age before the Titans, and would give it to whatever came after. This is the point in the telling where the war itself must be described, not its beginning, not its preparation, but its duration. The weight of 10 years pressed against the world, while the Olympians and the Titans held their positions and tested each other's resolve across the valley where the night bird flew without knowing what it moved between. The ancient accounts preserve something of what those years were like. They are worth dwelling on. Not because they were glamorous in the manner of later heroic wars, not because individual deeds of valor can be easily enumerated, but because the scale of it was unlike anything the world had known before or would know again. The poets who carried the tale forward reached for the largest comparisons they could find and found them insufficient. When the Titans launched their force from Othrys, the ground moved. Not metaphorically. The earth itself shifted, Gaia responding with tremors to the weight of what walked across her surface. The enormous elemental powers of the old order advancing and retreating across her body as though she were a battlefield and a participant simultaneously. The mountains that bordered the valley shook. Stones rolled from their positions on ridges and fell into the darkness below. The Titans fought with what they were. This is an important distinction. They did not use instruments in the way the Olympians now had instruments. Their power was constitutive, woven into their substance. The power of the world's first age when what a being was and what a being could do were not yet separated from each other. Hyperion, when he moved, brought with him the quality of blazing light. Creus, advancing, carried with him the weight of something older than mountains. Caius fought with the force of inquiry itself turned outward, probing, pressing, finding the weak points in whatever stood before him. Against this, the Olympians held Olympus. The holding itself was remarkable. 10 years is not a short time. The world continued beneath the war. Mortals went about their uncertain lives in the valleys and the coastal plains, noticing the tremors, observing that the sky sometimes lit in ways they did not understand, building their small fires against the dark and telling each other stories about what might be happening above the reach of their sight. The rivers ran changed. The poets say the sea boiled in places. Whether this is to be taken as a description of physical events, or as an account of what it felt like to live inside a world shaken by divine conflict, is a question the tale does not resolve. Both may be true simultaneously. The world during those 10 years was altered in the way that anything is altered when forces beyond its ordinary scale are brought to bear upon it. And neither side could break through. This is the part the tale dwells on with a kind of patience that mirrors the stalemate it describes. The Titans had endurance. They had occupied their stronghold at Othrys since before the Olympians were born. The mountain knew them. Its stone had received their weight for centuries. When they fought from it, they fought from a foundation that was theirs, in a way that Olympus was not yet fully the Olympians. Zeus held his mountain. He drove the Titans back when they advanced. He could not yet drive them down. The Olympians were powerful, yes, and growing into that power year by year, learning the weight of what they carried. But even with the thunderbolt, even with the trident and the helm, the question of how to end the war, rather than merely survive it, remained unanswered through year after year of assault and counter-assault. Mount Olympus endured under the weight of this. The cold, high air above its peak remained clear, even when the sky at lower altitudes was thick with the dust of broken earth and the strange luminescence that gathered around divine conflict. Standing on the summit, one could see the stars without obstruction, the same stars that had watched the age of Uranus, the same stars that had shone over the golden age while Cronus ruled from Othrys, and mortals lived without grief in the valleys below. The stars did not take sides. Below Othrys, the older landscape pressed its silence forward. There were places in the world that the war had not fully reached, valleys folded between hills where the tremors came only as a distant vibration in the earth, where the rivers ran in their usual courses, where deer moved through the trees at dusk with the unhurried certainty of creatures living outside the radius of concern for who would hold the sky. These places existed alongside the war. They are worth noting. The tale notices them. The world was larger than the conflict conducted within it, however vast that conflict was. The olive groves continued to exist. The bees continued their work. The cold springs at the base of mountains continued to issue their water into the light, indifferent to whether the mountains above them shook or stood steady. This is perhaps what sustained the Olympians through 10 years of inconclusion, not only strength, not only the instruments they held, but the knowledge of what they were fighting for. The world that continued below the war, the ordinary fabric of seasons and water and growth. The mortals with their small fires and their uncertain lives, this was what the new order was meant to govern, not simply to rule, but to provide the framework within which things could continue. The Titans had not conceived of their rule that way. The Golden Age had been a condition, not a governance. Cronus had held the cosmos from Othrys without fully attending to what happened beneath his dominion. The abundance of that age had been a property of the time itself, not a product of sustained care. When the war came, the Golden Age ended not because the Titans were driven out, but because the kind of time that produces such abundance cannot coexist with conflict at this scale. The Olympians knew. even in the middle of the war, that what came after would require a different kind of attention. Zeus knew it in the way that the bolt he held required intention to use properly. It was not a force that discharged itself. It waited on the hand that held it. It waited on judgment. Poseidon felt it in the trident, the way its 3 tines oriented themselves not randomly but directionally, each one pointing into one of the sea's distinct registers, asking to be used with knowledge of what it touched. Hades knew it through the helm, through the particular discipline of moving through the world without announcing one's presence, which required a precise understanding of where one was and what one was doing. Since nothing external confirmed or corrected it, the 10 years shaped them. Each year of the war was an education. Each Titan assault that they held against taught them something about the nature of the forces arrayed against them. Each counter-assault that failed to break through taught them something about the nature of their own limits. Night continued to hold the peak. Somewhere on Othrys, Cronus and his kin maintained their vigil on the opposing slope. The valley between the 2 mountains lay in the deep quiet of the middle hours, the rivers at its floor running in darkness. The night bird long since settled somewhere in the undergrowth between the 2 great presences that defined the world's current shape, 2 mountains. 2 orders, 10 years, and in the particular quality of the silence between them, a question that neither side had yet answered, though both understood it was the only question that mattered. How does one end a war between forces that are not, in any ordinary sense, destroyable? The morning when that answer would arrive had not yet come, but the night that preceded it was already carrying the answer in the way that all nights carry. What morning will reveal, quietly, without announcement, in the texture of the dark itself? The answer came not as a thought, but as a movement. It came with the first grey loosening of the dark above the eastern hills, when the night was not yet finished, but had begun its slow withdrawal from the world's upper edges. And in that hour, before full light arrived, the Hecatoncheires rose. They say the tale does not linger on what was felt on Othrys in that final morning. Some things are better held at a distance by those who tell them. But the tale knows what Cottus and Briareros and Gyges carried with them as they moved from Olympus's lower slopes into the open ground between the mountains. They carried the full weight of their imprisonment. Every year of it, every chain, every hour of the dark in Tartarus that had pressed against them without relief, without end, without the knowledge that any end would come. They had been held there since before the war, since before Zeus was born, since before Cronus took the throne that the sickle had opened for him. The Hecatoncheires had been underground since Uranus sealed them there in fear, and the length of that time was not a thing that could be measured in ordinary years. It had shaped them differently than war shapes soldiers. War teaches the body to hold itself ready for a single engagement. What the Hecatoncheires carried into that final assault was not readiness. It was the accumulated pressure of an age of darkness now finding its release. Each of the 50 heads, the 100 arms, the voices that the darkness of Tartarus had never heard. All of it moved into the open air of that pre-dawn hour with a force that the world's surface had not previously been asked to contain. The Titans felt them coming before they saw them. On Othrys there was a change in the quality of the ground beneath their feet, not a tremor in the ordinary sense. Something lower than tremor, something felt in the body's deepest registers before the mind could name it. Creus, who had stood against every Olympian assault through 10 years of war, lifted his gaze from the valley to the dark between the mountains. The weight older than mountains that was his particular nature recognized what moved toward him. It knew its own kind. It knew, in the way that stone knows stone, that what was coming had the same ancient origin he did, but older and angrier. Hyperion raised his light against the approaching dark, the blaze of him pushing against the pre-dawn in a final flare that turned the valley briefly brilliant. The stones of the hillside cast sharp shadows. The river at the valley's floor showed its surface for a moment, catching that cold light. the water running in its ordinary course even in this hour. Then the boulders came. The tale tells it plainly. 300 boulders simultaneously, each hecatoncheire releasing 100 at once, arm after arm after arm, the volley so complete and so coordinated that the air itself became stone for a moment, became a weight that fell on Othrys like a sentence being rendered. This is the chapter of the war that later voices would speak of with a particular kind of hush. Not because of the scale of it, though the scale was beyond what the world had seen, but because of what the scale represented. The final accounting. The hour in which 10 years of stalemate resolved into a single overwhelming motion. Othrys held for a moment. The mountain held as mountains do. With the deep refusal of stone that has been in place since before the shape of things was settled, the Titans gathered at its peak had that same refusal in their substance. Cronus, who had overthrown one order and ruled another, who had swallowed 5 gods and still held Othrys against a decade of assault, was not the kind of force that simply yields. But the mountain yielded first. Great sections of it fell away under the barrage. The stone that had held the Titans' vigil through 10 years of night cracked along lines that had waited, without knowing it, for this particular pressure. The slopes fractured. The summit shook. And with the mountain breaking beneath them, the Titans could no longer hold their ground. What followed was a falling, not a retreat. Not a withdrawal in the orderly sense of armies stepping back to regroup. This was a fall in the older meaning of the word. A descent that could not be corrected. The kind that, once begun, does not stop at any intermediate level, but continues downward until it reaches the bottom of what the world contains. Cronus fell. The tale holds this moment without excess. He was brought down not by Zeus alone, though Zeus was there, the bolt held in the hand that had spent 10 years learning what judgment the bolt required. Cronus was brought down by the convergence of what he had set in motion long ago. The decision to keep the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires imprisoned had come back to him, as all such decisions come back, through the very hands he had refused to free. His brothers fell with him. Creus, who had held the weight of the old world on his shoulders throughout the war, was driven from the summit into the downward rush of things. Coeus, who had probed at the nature of the Olympian order for 10 years with the careful persistent force of deep inquiry, fell without the answer he had been seeking. Hyperion's light went out. Not forever, for such things do not end, but in that morning it was extinguished from the high place where it had blazed, and the sky above the valley cleared into the pale ordinary light of early day. One by one the Titans were driven down. Each descent was its own. Some fought past the last moment, requiring force to continue them downward. Others arrived at the end of their resistance and simply ceased to press against it. What they shared was the direction. All of them moved toward Tartarus, toward the darkness below the darkness, toward the place where the Hecatoncheires had themselves once been held. The bronze gates stood open. They had been brought through in that final descent, carried down through the earth's layers until Tartarus received them. The gates closed behind the last of them, with the sound of a sentence ending, a sound that the tale does not describe further, but which those who were present would not have needed to describe. They knew what it meant. Every door that closes on a fallen order has that same quality in the closing. Inside, the darkness was complete. The same darkness the Hecatoncheires had known. Cronus, in that dark, was now what he had made of others. The tale does not record what he thought in that first hour of imprisonment. Perhaps there was nothing to record. Perhaps thought itself required some external orientation, some relationship with light or ground or sky, that Tartarus withheld. What the tale records is simpler. He was there, and the gates were shut. And outside those gates, the world above was beginning to rearrange itself around his absence. The Hecatoncheires took their positions before the bronze fence. They stood as wardens now. The 100 arms settled into stillness after the release of the barrage. the 50 heads of each turned outward toward the world they were now tasked to guard against. This was the other side of what Tartarus meant, not just a place of confinement, a threshold that required keeping. They kept it without complaint. They had, after all, known the inside. They understood precisely what the boundary they now stood before contained. No warden has ever been better suited to the work assigned to them. No guardianship has ever rested on knowledge more direct or more complete. Above all of this, the valley between the two mountains lay quiet. Othrys still stood, though fractured. The rivers still ran at its base. The morning light reached them now without obstruction from the conflict that had divided the sky above them. Small, ordinary things resumed their ordinary proportions. A bird crossed the valley at low altitude, its flight unhurried, its passage leaving no trace in the air behind it. The war was over. The tale sets that down plainly, without ceremony. 10 years, 2 mountains, 300 boulders in a single volley, and then the gates of Tartarus receiving what the world no longer had room for at its surface. Somewhere in the deep, Cronus held his silence in the dark. Among all those who had stood on the slopes of Othrys, one did not follow the others into Tartarus. Atlas remained above ground. The tale has preserved this distinction carefully, across many tellings and many centuries, because it matters in a way that simple imprisonment would not. The other Titans were taken below. Atlas was left standing. And what he was left standing beneath was the judgment that Zeus pronounced in the silence after the gates had closed. Some versions of the tale record the words of that judgment. Others say there were no words, that Zeus simply looked at Atlas, and Atlas understood, and the sky above them both shifted downward at that moment to rest upon his shoulders. Whether the words were spoken or withheld, the sentence was the same. Atlas would bear the weight of the celestial sphere at the western edge of the world. He would hold it there. He would not set it down. This was not the punishment given to a soldier who had simply fought on the wrong side. Atlas had led. He had stood at the front of Cronus's forces and kept order among the Titans through 10 years of grinding, unresolved conflict. He had held the Titan line when others wavered. He had made it possible for the war to last as long as it did. Zeus understood the difference between those who had followed and those who had directed, and the sentence Atlas received reflected it. What the tale lingers over in its quieter passages is not the punishment itself, but the moment of separation that came just before it. Among those who had descended through the earth toward Tartarus, some had fought beside Atlas for the full span of 10 years. Creus had stood at his left, Coeus at his right. They had spoken in the nights between battles, in the way that those who share a long and uncertain struggle speak, with brevity and with the particular weight of men who do not know what the morning will bring. They had shared counsel. They had divided watches. They had looked out from the height of Othrys at the distant outline of Olympus and discussed, with the measured calm of the very old, what they understood about the shape of the war and what it was moving toward. Those conversations were over now. The tale does not assign speeches to this parting. It did not happen in a way that allowed for speeches. The Titans fell, and Atlas did not fall with them, and by the time the gates had closed, there was no messenger between the two places, no thread of communication running from the surface to the dark below. What they had shared, the years of it, the particular knowledge that comes from standing near someone through long difficulty, that was sealed off as cleanly as Tartarus itself was sealed. Atlas stood in the morning light. The others did not. He had been given no time to speak to them before it was determined. The tale notes this without embellishment. He had not embraced his brothers before the descent. He had not been permitted a final word or a final look. The war ended quickly in its ending, and what had been 10 years of proximity was severed in a single hour. This is the quality of the punishment that tends to be forgotten when the image of Atlas bearing the sky is considered. The visual endures. The great figure bowed beneath the celestial weight, and that image is large enough to occupy the mind entirely, but behind the image is the silence of everything that came before it. Every voice Atlas knew from the years of the war was now unreachable. Every presence he had measured himself against was gone. He was placed at the edge of the world, not the center. Not the summit. The western edge, where the land ends and the ocean of Oceanus runs outward toward the dark. A place that is neither quite of the world nor beyond it, but at its boundary, where the sky meets the sea. He knelt there. The sky descended. The tale describes the weight of the celestial sphere in terms that are not of stone or metal, but of duration. It is not heavy in the way that mountains are heavy. It is heavy in the way that endlessness is heavy. The sphere does not press down once and remain constant. It presses down with every moment that passes, with every star that moves through its arc, with the whole turning motion of what is above the world. Atlas received this weight and did not fall. That part the tale is certain of. Whatever had made him the general of the Titan forces, whatever capacity for endurance had kept him at the front of a 10-year war without breaking, that same capacity was now directed inward toward the simple act of remaining upright beneath the sky. He did not speak. No one was near enough to hear him if he had. The Olympians moved to other concerns. Zeus turned back toward Olympus. Poseidon moved toward the sea. Hades descended by his own path into the underworld's other quarter, the one that was not Tartarus. They did not watch Atlas receive his sentence in any sustained way. They set it in motion, and then the world drew them forward, as the world does, toward its next requirement, and Atlas remained. The tale holds a particular stillness around him in this early passage of his punishment. Before centuries had accumulated, before other myths had grown up around him. There is the western edge of the world. There is the sky. There is Atlas between them. There is the ocean running outward in every direction from where he stands. He had known the company of the Titans for the full length of his memory. They had existed alongside him as the fundamental furniture of his world, as present and unremarkable as the mountains. Their absence was not a grief he could set down between moments of bearing the sky. It was continuous. It moved through everything. The celestial sphere turned slowly above him. The stars moved through their courses. The morning light in the valley between Othrys and Olympus was full by now, the pale grey giving way to the ordinary gold of a day in the world above. Othrys stood fractured in that light, its summit split, its slopes bearing the marks of the barrage and the decade that had preceded it. The river at its base caught the light and moved on without comment. Atlas did not look back toward Othrys from the western edge. The distance was too great, and the sky pressed down with the particular weight of its endlessness, and looking back would not have changed what the gates had sealed. He faced westward. He held the sky. The tale says nothing of what he carried with him into that long silence, no inventory of memory or loss. It only records the position and the weight and the direction he faced, west, away from the valley, away from Othrys, away from everything that had preceded this hour, and toward the ocean, which runs outward in every direction from the edge of the world, and which does not answer. While Atlas stood at the world's western edge, other things were settling into their new shapes. This is the nature of aftermath. It does not wait for grief to finish before it moves forward. The world had a new order to arrange, and the arrangement had already begun. Far to the east, beneath the roots of the earth, Tartarus was receiving its occupants. The tale describes Tartarus not as a single chamber, but as a vastness, a region as far below the surface of the earth is below the vault of heaven. Some versions say a bronze anvil dropped from the sky would fall for 9 days before reaching the ground. The same anvil dropped from the ground would fall 9 days more before reaching Tartarus. The distance was not merely physical, it was absolute. A separation so complete that the word separation seems insufficient to describe it. Around that region, the old tellers say, ran a bronze fence. Not stone, not iron. Bronze, the same metal that had rung across the battlefield for 10 years, the material of shields and helmets and the clash of armies, now it ran in a continuous circle around the deepest place in the world. A perimeter that enclosed what the Olympians needed enclosed. Above the bronze fence rose walls. The tale says they were wrapped in night. Not that the walls were dark, or that darkness gathered near them, but that night itself was used as a building material. 3 layers of it pressed into permanence, a darkness that did not shift with the hours. A darkness that did not thin toward dawn. Within those walls, within that fence, in that vast region below all regions, the Titans were placed. Cronus was among them, he who had held the sky throne, who had swallowed 5 gods and ruled what was called a golden age, who had taken the sickle from his mother's hand and used it without hesitation on his father. He entered Tartarus, and the bronze gates closed behind him, and the night-built walls stood between him and the world he had governed. What the tale does not record is any final speech from him. No pronouncement. No curse on Zeus to mirror the one Uranus had spoken at his own defeat. Perhaps the tradition simply lost it, perhaps there was nothing said. 10 years of war and a sudden ending leave little room for ceremony. He was there. Then the gates closed. Then he was not in the world any longer. The Hecatoncheires took their position as wardens. This is its own particular irony, which the old tellers seem to have appreciated. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the 100-handed ones, had been imprisoned in Tartarus by Uranus for the entirety of the Titan age. They had known its walls from the inside. Now they stood outside those same walls as their keepers. The beings who had once been sealed within were now the seal. They required nothing from the Olympians to perform this task. They understood the architecture intimately. The tale does not suggest they felt satisfaction in the reversal. They were not made for satisfaction or resentment. They were made for endurance and for force, and both were now directed toward the simple, enormous work of standing watch, 300 arms at rest along the outer wall. 50 heads each turned toward the bronze perimeter, patient in the way that only ancient things can be patient. The world above them continued in ordinary ways. Birds crossed the sky, rivers ran toward the sea. The grasses of the mountain slopes, flattened and scorched by a decade of celestial violence, began their slow work of recovery, and at Delphi, at the place the Greeks would later call Pytho, a stone was set into the earth. This was the stone that Rhea had wrapped in swaddling cloth and presented to Cronus at Zeus's birth. The stone he had swallowed whole, believing it was the child that would end his rule. When the emetic potion had undone him, when the 5 gods had come forth, the stone had come forth too, and it had been set aside in the confusion of reunion and preparation for war. Now it found its resting place. Zeus placed it at Delphi, or in some versions of the tale it was set there by custom and consensus, placed at the location where the sacred vapours rose from a cleft in the rock, where the earth spoke in riddles and the prophetic tradition was already ancient. The stone sat at the centre of a world that was still finding its edges. The Greeks called it the omphalos, the navel, the centre stone. They built a sacred site around it. Pilgrims would come for centuries, across many generations of mortals, to stand near it and feel that they were standing at the middle of the world. The stone itself was ordinary in appearance. It did not glow. It made no sound. A rounded rock, uncut, set into the sacred precinct at Delphi, but it was the stone that had been mistaken for a god. It had travelled inside a Titan king. It had been returned to the world at the moment the old order cracked open. And now it marked the point from which all distances in the known world were measured. This is the kind of object the tale lingers over, not because of what it is, but because of what it has witnessed. The sickle that Cronus used on Uranus had its own history of this kind. The swaddling cloth that had deceived the most powerful being in the world had this quality. The omphalos stone carried the whole arc of the succession within it, and it did this by simply existing in a fixed place while everything around it changed. The tellers of different versions agree on this much. The stone at Delphi was the stone from the swaddling. The detail survived because it connected the sacred site to the oldest story. When someone stood at Delphi and placed a hand on the omphalos, they were touching the same object that had once rested in the belly of Cronus while the hidden god grew to strength on a distant island. Time had run from that point to this 10 years of war and all the decades before it, and the stone sat at the center of it, unremarkable and irreplaceable. Far to the west, the celestial sphere continued turning. Stars came around in their courses. The ocean ran outward in every direction from the edge where Atlas held his position. The waters did not trouble themselves with what stood at the boundary between land and sea. They moved as they had always moved, and they would continue moving in this way through everything the world was now becoming. Atlas held the sky above the place where the world had no more ground to offer. The tale marks this moment, the close of the war's immediate aftermath with that image. Not with ceremony, not with a pronouncement from Olympus. Just the figure at the western edge, the turning sky, the ocean, and the quiet, Tartarus sealed below. Delphi marked at the center, Atlas fixed at the western boundary. 3 points, each carrying a different weight from the war. 1, a prison. 1, a marker of what had been mistaken and survived. 1, a sentence that had no walls and no gates, only the endless sky pressing down on the one who had led the defeated side and the water beyond him. Running outward in every direction, saying nothing at all. Among those who had not raised arms against Zeus, there were some whose continued presence in the world required no negotiation and no pardon. Themis had stood apart from the war. Not from weakness, not from indecision. The tale makes this distinction carefully, because the difference matters. Themis, daughter of Gaia and Uranus, was the embodiment of divine order, of the laws that existed before any king thought to write them down. She had watched the Titanomachy from a remove that was neither cowardice nor neutrality in the ordinary sense. She simply understood that what was unfolding could not be unmade by her participation in either direction. The tale tells it this way. Themis did not fight for Cronus because she had seen what the war's conclusion would be, and she did not fight for Zeus because the victory would come regardless of her sword arm. She held divine law within herself the way the earth holds water, not as a choice, but as a condition of what she was. When the last Titan fell and the gates of Tartarus closed, Themis remained. She was still standing in the world, calm and unhurried, as the smoke of the long war thinned across the mountain slopes. Her robes, the colour of pale stone, were undamaged. Her scales, which she carried before any temple had been built to honour her, hung level. They had not tipped during the war. They did not tip now. Some versions of the tale suggest that Zeus sought her counsel even before the thrones were formally divided. He was young, in the way that gods can be young, and he had won through force and through the gratitude of freed giants. But winning and ruling are different things. He understood the first. The second required Themis. She came to Olympus in the aftermath without being summoned. Or perhaps she was summoned, and the tale has simply forgotten to say so. Because her arrival was so natural a part of what followed that no one thought to mark the invitation, she arrived and she was present. And the presence of divine order in the newly arranged court of Olympus was simply how things continued. The tale does not record what she said to Zeus in those first days. It records only what she represented, the unbroken thread of law that ran from before the Titans through them, and now out the other side into whatever the new order would become. Cronus had ruled with a sickle and a prophesied fear. Zeus would rule with that fear still present, but Themis stood beside the throne as a reminder that fear alone cannot hold a cosmos together. Law must also run through it, the way roots run through soil, unseen and necessary. Mnemosyne too had endured. She was memory, in the oldest understanding of that word. Not memory as the mind's faint recollection of a particular afternoon, but memory as the fabric from which knowledge is woven, as the capacity of the world to hold what had happened within it and carry it forward. She was a Titaness, sister to Themis, daughter of the first great union of earth and sky. During the war, Mnemosyne had not been at Othrys. The tale places her elsewhere, in a quiet valley or on a hillside where no battle reached, simply continuing her function. She held the shapes of things. She held the sounds of words spoken in ages before any mortal had come into the world to use language for ordinary purposes. She held the names of the rivers and the arrangements of the constellations and the sequence of seasons that had run before the war broke them and would run again once the war had finished. Without Mnemosyne, the world would have had no record of itself. This is a quiet kind of power. It makes no impact on a battlefield. It cannot be wielded like a thunderbolt or a trident. It simply persists, carrying the accumulated weight of everything that has occurred, so that what comes next has something to build upon. The new gods would call on her in time. Zeus would come to her, and from their union would come the 9 Muses, daughters of memory and sky, who would later teach mortals to make poetry, music, history, and dance. The arts of civilization would be born from the meeting of the king of the gods and the oldest record keeper, but that was still ahead in the tale. For now, Mnemosyne simply moved through the recovering world, holding what she had always held. The Titanesses, broadly, escaped the fate of their brothers. Thea, who had been mother to the sun and moon, remained. Tethys, the nourishing sea, continued her work alongside Oceanus, who had also kept his distance from the field of battle. The encircling river ran on, as it had run through the Golden Age and through the war, indifferent to which generation of divine beings held the mountain thrones. Phoebe, the Radiant One, endured. Her sanctuary at Delphi, some versions of the tale suggest, predated the Omphalos stone. The prophetic tradition at that cleft in the rock had older roots than Zeus's victory. Phoebe had held the oracle before Apollo would one day claim it. The knowledge that rose from that fissure in the earth had passed through several hands, each custodian carrying it forward without breaking the thread. Now the stone sat in the sacred precinct, and Delphi held 2 ancient things together at once, the crack in the earth that spoke, and the rounded stone that had once been swallowed by a king, both ordinary from a distance, both carrying enormous histories. A pilgrim standing at Delphi stood at the crossing point of those 2 streams, the prophetic tradition and the physical object that marked the turning of one age to another. This is what the tale is attentive to in this chapter of its telling, not the clash of armies, not the brightness of the thunderbolt, but the figures who remained after the brightness had faded, standing in the recovering world, continuing their work. Themis with her scales, Mnemosyne with her accumulated weight of knowing, the Titanesses moving through a landscape that was theirs before it was anyone else's, and would continue being theirs in the new arrangement because what they carried could not be reassigned by the drawing of lots or the outcome of war. The world needed divine law. The world needed memory. The world needed the oracular tradition at Delphi, the encircling river, the light that Thea's children carried across the sky each day. These did not belong to the old order or the new order. They belonged to the structure of the cosmos itself. The Titanomachy had decided who would sit on what throne. It had not decided whether the sun would continue rising, whether law would hold its meaning, whether memory would persist. Those things had been settled at a deeper level of creation, before even the first sickle was fashioned, before the first prophecy was whispered through stone and root. Themis understood this. She stood on Olympus in the quiet that followed the war. And she held what she had always held, her scales hanging in the still air, level and patient. The new king was young, the arrangement was new, but what she carried was older than any of it, and it would shape the reign that was just beginning in ways that force alone could never accomplish. The scales hung level, the vapours rose from the cleft at Delphi. The omphalos stone sat in its precinct, neither glowing nor silent in the sacred sense, simply present. The way all objects of enormous history are present, asking nothing, recording everything by virtue of having been there when everything changed. And so the tale moves, as it must, toward the question of what comes next. The war had ended. The Titans were bound. The weapons had been set down or placed in the hands that would carry them forward into a new age. The world lay quiet beneath a sky that was, for the first time in 10 years, no longer burning. 3 brothers stood at the centre of what remained: Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. They had been swallowed by their father before they could speak or walk. They had been vomited back into a world already poised for war. They had fought beside each other through a decade of fire and stone, and now the fire was out and the stone was settled. And there was a cosmos to be divided among them. The tale tells of lots drawn in a vessel. 3 names, or 3 symbols, cast together and shaken. The vessel passed between them, and each reached in without looking, and what each drew determined the shape of all that followed. Zeus drew the sky. It suited him. He had been the one to forge the alliance, to descend into Tartarus, to break the chains of the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires. His was the hand that had held the thunderbolt first. His was the voice that had spoken the terms of war. The sky and the high seat of Olympus were, in some sense, already his before the lot confirmed it. Poseidon drew the sea. He walked to its edge when the drawing was done, and the waters rose slightly, as if they recognized the hand that would now command them. He had wielded the trident through 10 years of fighting. He understood force and depth and the way pressure builds beneath a surface before releasing itself in waves. The sea suited him as the sky suited his brother. Each realm a mirror of the god who received it. Hades drew the underworld. The tale does not say he was displeased, nor does it say he was content. He accepted the lot with the same quiet that had always marked him among his siblings. He had worn the helm of darkness through the war, moving through enemy lines as a shadow that carried no reflection. The underworld was its own kind of darkness, a place where names accumulated without end, where every mortal life that had ever been lived would eventually arrive, leaving behind the sunlit world for the permanent quiet of the below. He descended, and the underworld received him. The earth and Olympus remained common ground, held between the 3 and belonging wholly to none. The earth beneath every mortal foot was neither Zeus's province, nor Poseidon's, nor Hades's. It was the place where all their influences met and overlapped. Where rain fell from the sky, Zeus commanded onto the soil from which the seasons moved. Where rivers ran toward the sea, Poseidon governed. Where the dead descended through stone and root toward the kingdom Hades had accepted. The drawing of lots settled what the war had not quite settled. Force had determined who would rule. The lots determined over what, and once the lots had spoken, the new order took its shape with surprising swiftness. There is something in a firm division that allows arrangements to solidify. When the boundaries are clear, the structure holds. Olympus became the seat of the gods who would now govern the cosmos, its marble halls and endless light and thin, cold air above the clouds. The gods gathered there, and the first councils began. These early councils on Olympus were unlike anything the world had known. The Titans had ruled through sheer presence, through the weight of ancient and elemental power. A Titan like Hyperion did not need to deliberate. The sun crossed the sky because Hyperion's children carried it, and that was the shape of things, and there was no question to be asked about it. But the Olympians were different, younger, and in their youth more inclined to argument. Zeus was their king, and his thunderbolt was not in question, but he was surrounded by gods with their own natures and their own domains and their own minds. Hera, who had been swallowed as an infant and returned fully formed with a dignity that expected acknowledgment. Demeter, who held the grain and the harvest and understood that the world would starve without her cooperation. Poseidon, whose sea could swallow coastlines if his patience ran out. The councils on Olympus were, from the beginning, a negotiation. Themis stood at these councils. Her scales hung beside her in the clean air of the hall. She did not argue. She did not insist. She simply was present with what she carried, and her presence meant that the deliberations had a shape they would not otherwise have possessed. Divine law does not coerce. It orients. It gives the assembled gods a direction to face, a standard against which decisions can be measured, even if those decisions sometimes fell short of it. Zeus observed this in the early councils, and he understood it. He would make many decisions in the reign that was beginning. Some would be swift, and some would be considered. Some would be wise, and some would be the decisions of a young king who had not yet learned where his own judgment failed him. But he was attentive, and Themis, standing at the edge of the hall with her level scales, gave him something to be attentive toward. The tale does not mark this moment with ceremony. No altar was raised. No oath was spoken over fire. Themis had not come to Olympus because she had been invited. She had come because she was what she was, and what she was belonged wherever judgment was being made. Outside, the world continued the slow work of recovery. Rivers found their old channels again. The sea, which had boiled during the worst years of the war, cooled back to its deep, indifferent green. Mountains that had cracked under the weight of hurled boulders stood with their broken faces open to the sky, bearing their scars without complaint. The seasons, which had been disrupted through the long years of battle, began to reassert themselves. Spring followed winter with a tentativeness at first, then with greater confidence. The fields that had lain scorched or abandoned began to stir. Seeds that had waited in cold soil for years sent up the first fragile shoots of their return. Mortals watched this from their settlements. Uncertain at first what the recovery meant, they knew that something enormous had changed. The sky had been different during the war. The earth had shaken in ways that went beyond ordinary tremors. The sea had done things seas should not do. And now the shaking had stopped, and the sky was clear, and the sea was level, and the seasons were returning in their proper order. They did not know the name of what had ended, but they recognized the restoration of rhythm. And in recognizing it, they began, slowly, to go back to their ordinary work, the work of planting and tending and building, the work of naming children and gathering at fires, the modest, essential labors that require a stable world to hold them. Hades had descended to his kingdom. Poseidon moved through the deep water of his domain. Zeus sat at the top of Olympus, the thunderbolt resting near his hand, not because he expected to use it, but because it was his, and it was the mark of what he now was. The lots had been drawn. The realms had been divided. The first councils had convened in the high hall of Olympus, with Themis present and the scales hanging level in the still air. What remained was simply the long work of the reign that was now beginning. The gods on their thrones were young by the measure of such things. The age ahead of them stretched further than any of them could see. But the shape of it had been decided. In the drawing of lots from a vessel passed between three brothers who had once been swallowed and returned. The rounded stone sat at Delphi. The scales hung on Olympus. The encircling river of Oceanus ran its course at the edge of the world, and at the western margin of the earth, where sky meets the last light of day, Atlas stood with the celestial sphere across his shoulders, holding up what his rebellion had assigned him to hold. Beneath everything there was Gaia. She had been there before the war began, before the sickle was shaped, before the prophecy was spoken. before Uranus arched himself across her and held her too tightly, and she began, in her slow way, to plan. She had been there when the first Titan drew breath. She had been there when the first stone of Olympus was laid, and she was there now, in the long quiet after, while the world above her settled back into itself. The tale does not give her words in this moment, no speech, no declaration. She had spoken when speaking was needed. She had counselled Rhea when Rhea was desperate. She had whispered to Zeus in the deep dark of Tartarus, guiding his hands toward the chains that most needed breaking. She had given the world every tool it required to arrive at this resting place. And now she rested too, in the only way a thing as vast as the earth can rest. The rivers were clear again. Not all of them, not yet. Some still carried silt disturbed by the war, brown with the memory of upheaval. But most had found their old paths once more. Water has a long memory for where it belongs, and it returned without being told. The rivers ran down from mountains to plains, from plains to the sea, as they had before the war began, as if the years of battle had been a held breath and the world was now exhaling. Gaia felt this as a easing, not relief precisely, for relief belongs to creatures with expectations, and Gaia's awareness was older and stranger than that. It was more like the settling of stone after an earthquake, the pressure finding a new arrangement, the weight redistributing, not comfort but equilibrium. Deep within her body, in the lowest chambers of Tartarus, the Titans were bound. She had borne them. That was a fact that did not change simply because they were imprisoned. Cronus had come from her, shaped by her, set loose upon the world by her own hand and her own need. The sickle had been hers before it was his. She had planned what he carried out. And when his time was done, when the long spiral of consequence brought his children to Olympus and his own body to a bronze gate, she did not grieve for him in any simple way. But she knew he was there, beneath her, as everything eventually was. The roots of mountains pressed down into the earth where the Titans lay. The cold stone that surrounded Tartarus was her stone. Their silence was a silence she contained. It was not a pleasant knowledge, but it was hers, and she held it the way she held everything, without choosing to set it down. Above her the sky was clear. That was new in the long accounting of things. For years the sky had been torn open by lightning and scorched by forces hurled between two peaks. The clouds had burned. The upper air had smelled of fire and struck metal. She had borne all of it against her back, the whole weight of that burning, and she had not broken. Now the sky was simply itself again, blue in the long hours of day, black and cold when Nyx drew her covering across it. Helios moved through it as he had always moved, on his appointed course, his light falling clean and even across the landscape below. Eos, rose-fingered, opened the day at the eastern edge of the world. The sky asked nothing of the earth but to receive its light, and the earth asked nothing of the sky but to be held by it. It was, perhaps, the oldest arrangement there was. Gaia had set this war in motion because Uranus had stopped honouring it. He had held the earth too tightly, pressing down instead of arching over, burying what needed room to grow. The sickle had been the correction of that. Everything that followed, the Titans, the swallowed gods, the 10 years of burning sky had grown from that first correction like water spreading from a cracked vessel. She did not think in terms of intention. She did not weigh what she had done and pronounce it good or necessary. She was not a god who reasoned over her actions. She was something older than reasoning. She had done what was in her to do in each moment, and the world was now the shape that her doing had produced. The Cyclopes were free. That mattered to her, though she would not have named it gladly. They were her grandchildren, imprisoned by Uranus before they had done anything to deserve it, held in the dark beneath her body for an age of the world. Now they breathed open air. Their forges rang in whatever high place they had chosen. The sound of their hammering was a kind of rightness. The Hecatoncheires stood watch at Tartarus. That too was a fact she held without celebration. They had been imprisoned as the Cyclopes had been imprisoned, and they had been freed as the Cyclopes had been freed, and now they kept a gate rather than stood behind one. It was not freedom exactly, but it was different. They were not sealed in the dark. They stood at its edge, on the boundary between the world and what lay below it, which was a position not without its own strange dignity. She felt the weight of Atlas at the western margin of the world. His feet were planted on her surface. He had always stood on her, as all things did, but now his standing had a different character. The celestial sphere rested on his shoulders, and he held it upward, preventing sky from descending onto earth the way Uranus once had descended, thoughtlessly crushing what lay beneath. There was an irony in that, though irony is a mortal's word for what Gaia perceived as pattern. Atlas had fought against the new order. He had been among the fiercest of those who stood for Cronus. His punishment was to hold the sky apart from the earth forever, and in holding it he performed the one service that would keep the old wound from reopening. He kept sky and earth separated. He did the work that the war had been fought to make permanent. She did not pity him. Pity was not in her nature, but she was aware of him as she was aware of everything that touched her. And his slow endurance was something she recognized. The grain was beginning to grow again in the fields near mortal settlements. Small green lines of it rising from dark soil, thin and tentative. Not yet the thick stands of summer harvest, but present, alive. The mortals who had planted it did not know what had changed above them. They knew the seasons were returning to their proper pace. They knew the ground felt stable in a way it had not felt for years. They planted into that stability without needing to understand its cause. Demeter would come to them in time. Her domain was their harvest, and she would not neglect it. But for now the grain grew on its own momentum, responding to warmth and moisture and the long patience of seeds. Gaia held the seeds and the roots and the cooling rivers and the bronze-sealed gates of Tartarus, and the feet of Atlas and the stone at Delphi, and the bones of the mountains and the silence of the deep and the small tender shoots at the edges of mortal fields. She held all of it, and she was still, not peaceful, because stillness and peace are not the same in a body as vast and old as the earth. There was too much within her for peace, too many old griefs pressed into her lower strata, too many things that had been done and could not be undone. The Titans were real. Her grief over them was real. The corrections had been real. None of it dissolved simply because the war was over. But the war was over. That was what remained at the bottom of the accounting, the way bedrock remains at the bottom of all soil. The shaking had stopped. The sky was held. The rivers had found their channels. The shape of the world going forward had been decided by gods younger than her oldest memories. She had planted the seeds of all of it long ago, in the age when she first looked up at Uranus and understood what needed to change. Now she lay beneath the recovered sky, and the roots of everything alive reached down into her. And she received them, and the morning light crossed her surface from east to west, following the path Helios had travelled since before the Titans were named. The morning did not announce itself. It arrived the way all mornings arrived on a world still learning to recover. Eos drew her rose-coloured light across the eastern horizon without ceremony, without fanfare. The sky accepted it. The land below accepted it. And beneath the land, Gaia felt the familiar warmth moving across her surface like a slow hand passing over stone. She had felt 10,000 such mornings. 10,000 such arrivals of pale light following the black hours of Nyx. But this one was different in the way that all things following long disruption carry a quality of newness. Not because the light was different. The light was what it had always been. But the silence underneath it had changed its texture. There was no burning in the upper air. no clashing from the high peaks, no trembling in the deep foundations where boulder met bronze and force met force. The silence was whole. On Olympus the gods were settling into the work of governance. Gaia perceived it not as sound, but as a new kind of pressure along her northern ridges, the weight of thrones being occupied, the weight of divine will taking root in a fixed place. Zeus sat in the sky above her peaks. Poseidon moved through her coastal edges, where the sea pressed against her shores and withdrew. Hades descended into the part of her that was not quite her, the borderland between the living earth and the underworld, where her stone grew cold and the roots of living things did not reach. 3 brothers. 3 claims upon the world. She had watched them when they were nothing. When Rhea came to her in desperation, fleeing to Crete with the secret of the infant Zeus wrapped in the necessity of survival, she had received that child as she received all things, with the kind of vast, impersonal holding that is the only tenderness available to something as large as a world. She had not loved him in the way mortals use that word, but she had held the ground beneath his cave. She had kept the roots of the mountain firm while the curettes clashed their shields above. She had been the stability into which his early life was pressed. Now that child sat on a throne of cloud and lightning, and the world had the shape of what he had accomplished, not what he had planned. Plans are mortal things. What he had accomplished was the result of forces older than any plan, set loose by a sickle, by a stone, by a mother's grief repeated twice across 2 generations. Mnemosyne was still in the world. That mattered. In the quiet way small continuities matter after large disruptions. She walked somewhere on the earth's surface, one of the Titanesses who had not been sent below. Her name meant memory, and memory had survived the war intact, which was perhaps the one outcome no one had needed to plan for. Memory persists without being told to. It finds its way into the bones of mountains and the sediment of riverbeds, and the particular way a field remembers the shape of flooding long after the flood has receded. The tale says memory is the mother of the muses, that from Mnemosyne and Zeus would eventually come the 9 voices of poetry and song and history. But that was still ahead, in a future Gaia held without urgency. For now, Mnemosyne simply walked, and the earth remembered, as it had always remembered, pressing every event that had ever occurred into its deep strata. Layer by layer, one age upon another. Themis, too, was free. She had stood apart from the war with the precise neutrality of someone who understands law too well to fight for any single application of it. She had not sided with the Titans, nor had she needed to side with the Olympians. She was divine law itself, and divine law had no faction. It had only weight. It had only the patient certainty that whatever order emerges from conflict must eventually answer to something larger than victory. Already she was being drawn toward Zeus's court. Her council would find a place there. Gaia felt this as a kind of rightness, not unlike the rightness of the Cyclopes hammering. The old order was not simply erased and replaced. Parts of it were folded into the new. Themis, carrying her scales into the halls of Olympus, was continuity wearing a different garment. The law did not start over. The law deepened. Far to the west, Atlas stood. His feet were still on her. The celestial sphere still rested on his shoulders. He had not moved, could not move, and the weight he bore was visible to any traveller who reached the margin of the known world and looked toward the horizon where the sky met the ocean and a great figure stood between them. Some mortal, eventually, would see him and tell others, and the telling would become part of the larger story. The story that was still being formed, still finding its shape. In these early days after the war's ending, the stone at Delphi sat on her surface at the place the ancient accounts named the navel of the world. It was an ordinary stone in the way that no stone is ordinary when it has been swallowed by a titan and vomited back into the open air. Cronus had taken it for a child. He had held it inside himself through seasons of fearful vigilance. And when the reckoning came, when the potion Meti prepared did its patient work, the stone emerged first. Before Hestia, before any of the swallowed gods. The stone had preceded the Olympians into freedom. Now it sat at Delphi, at the point where Gaia felt the world's weight converge, the place the Greeks would one day call the center of the earth, a marker of transition, a remnant of the deception that had saved the new order from being consumed before it could begin. It was a modest object for all it represented, smooth, cold, no different to the eye than 1,000 other stones on 1,000 other hillsides, but it was placed there. And placement carries meaning even without ceremony. The bronze gates of Tartarus were sealed. Below those gates, the Titans were settled into their long sentence. Cronus among them, who had once swallowed time itself in the form of his children, and who now existed outside of time in the only way that is possible, in the unchanging dark where no season reaches. He was not dead. Gods do not die in the way the tales tell it. He was held, contained, the way a stone holds the memory of a river that ran over it 10,000 years ago. She held the weight of all of them, her imprisoned children, her imprisoned grandchildren now freed, the great Titan generals standing at the world's edge, the stone placed at the world's center. She held the new gods on their mountain, and the mortal fields with their first thin shoots, and the rivers still clearing themselves of the war's silt. None of it was resolved. In the sense that resolution implies a final stillness, life does not settle into final stillness. It settles into the next arrangement, which contains within it the seeds of the one after that. The Olympians were young. Their quarrels would come. Their loves and errors and great strange stories would accumulate across ages that Gaia would feel as pressure and warmth and occasional trembling. The world was not finished. The world was never finished. But this particular long work was complete. The sickle had been shaped and used, and its purpose fulfilled. The prophecy had spoken and been answered. The children had been swallowed and returned. The war had burned for a decade across the skin of the earth, and then gone quiet. The bronze gates had been sealed. Rest now, the tale is told. When sleep feels distant again, Olympus dreams will be here, and subscribing makes it easier to find your way back to these ancient shores. Gaia lay beneath the recovered sky, beneath the feet of mortals who would never know her name as she knew theirs, beneath the first green growth pushing upward through dark soil, beneath the path of Helios crossing steadily from east to west in his daily passage, and somewhere in her deepest stone, in a chamber older than any Titan name, the echo of the first hammer strike that shaped the adamantine sickle still rang. Very faint, the way all first things ring in the places that receive them.